Two things you ought to know at the outset about the Grunfeld. One, it's a dynamic opening, and fluid counterplay is the order of the day. In the Grunfeld, black often allows white to dominate the centre early on, but then he's going to hit back at that centre and try to destroy it. Keep active in the Grunfeld. This is very important. Passive play in the Grunfeld rarely pays dividends for black. So with those observations in mind, it's time now to turn our attention to the first system under discussion. And this is the very important exchange variation where white plays c takes d5. I estimate you are going to get this in at least 50% of your games with the Grunfeld. And there are good reasons for this. With c takes d5, white allows himself to get a big centre with e4. Black's more or less got to take on c3, bishop g7. And now white has many different ways to deploy his pieces. It's this variety and this ability to take the centre so easily that attracts a lot of white players. But black should be satisfied too. The bishop on g7 is unobstructed, and there are definite chances to break down the white centre with a well-timed c5. We're going to be looking at most of the important exchange variation systems which white can play, and I'll be suggesting solutions for black against each. Some of these solutions might not be regarded as best by the theory books, but I'm interested in what works in practical play. Now the first system I want to consider is bishop c4. A move I think first played and popularised by Alexander Alekhine, and a very logical move too, because the bishop's on probably its most aggressive square, eyeing f7, and white basically intends to put his knight on e2. The advantage of knight e2, as opposed to knight f3, is fairly clear. The knight can't be pinned with bishop g4, and the f-pawn is free to go. It's this aggressive option of pushing the f-pawn that once again attracts a lot of white players to this variation. Now in the books you're going to see that most of them recommend c5 in this position. But I'd like to suggest an old variation of Larsson's, which I believe could give white a few problems and certainly should set him thinking. It's a line which is being played more and more these days at the end of 2009 and which is achieving good results for black. And that is the rather unusual queen d7. That's a peculiar idea. What on earth could be the point in black playing his queen up to d7 in this position? Well, black certainly has to now think about how he's going to deploy his queenside pieces. The usual way is to bring the knight out to c6, to push the pawn up to b6, bishop comes to b7, the knight on c6 goes to a5, and eventually a well-timed c5 will come, attacking white's centre. Now I just want to compare this, just going back one move, with perhaps a line where black plays b6 straight away. This may introduce the same scheme, but black's reasoning in playing b6 is that he doesn't want to declare the position of his queen so early in the game. Well, against b6 it turns out that the move h4 is strong, which brings us right back to our game. And what now would happen if white played h4? Well, Larsson's intention in this position was to bring his queen out to g4. This halts white's attack, and in fact, due to the pressure on e4 and g2, more or less forces the exchange of queens after knight g3, which of course is not what white wants. I mean, actually, I imagine in this position, after king takes d1 and now c5, black is better already. So that's the first point of queen d7. Which brings us to my opening game, the game Nicolas Coursager versus Romain Picard, played in Caen, France in 2009, where white played the very sensible reply, castles. Well, this doesn't hinder black in the completion of his opening plan, and Picard played b6. Basically, where white allows black to execute his plan, I believe that black should get a very comfortable game. And after queen d3, black played bishop b7. So the plan now is either to play c5 straight away, or knight c6, knight a5, and then c5. Coursager played f4. Well, this is one of the reasons why white keeps his knight on e2 in this line, so why not go through with the plan? Knight c6, and in order to give his bishop a bit of room on the diagonal, white plays a4, intending after knight a5 to retreat the bishop to a2. Now black gets c5 in. Okay, this move is absolutely indispensable in most lines of the Grunfeld. Commit it to memory and try and play it whenever you can. It's so important for black to gain counterplay against white's centre here. I mean, if he didn't play c5, what could he play? Think of it that way. For instance, it's easy for white to find a plan here. White could just plough through with f5. So black must attack the white centre in order to try and force concessions. Well, white defended his centre with bishop e3, and black now just played e6. Another very good move, blocking the bishop on a2, and also hindering white, or dissuading him, from playing f5. So white moved his queen out of the way, queen c2, and black naturally brought his rook to c8. So from the opening, I think you can say that black has achieved a very comfortable position. All his pieces are developed, and he's got counterplay against white's centre. D takes c5. I think, actually, if we go back, black was threatening to win a pawn here with pawn takes d4 due to the unprotected white queen on c2. So that's why white takes on c5. And 𝐶𝐫𝐧𝐽, who is a 2300 player, played his knight to g3. And clearly the intention after that is to play e5, blocking in the bishop on g7, go knight e4, and eye up the squares d6 and f6. So black moves to intercept this with bishop a6. As I say, active play is the order of the day in the Grunfeld. Black must keep his pieces aggressively posted. Rook fd1. Well, this is the first minor victory for black, as white's rook leaves the f-file. Now the threat of f5 is receding, or at very least it's not as dangerous as it was, and after queen c6, black continues to enjoy a comfortable game. e5, so white's getting on with his plan, and now black has to, again, intercept the idea of knight e4. He could play bishop b7, but that would allow rook d6, so he plays rook cd8, challenging white's command of the open file, whereupon white plays c4, blocking out the bishop. Now, if we just drop back, the first point to note is that knight e4, which seems to be a good move, because it threatens knight d6 and knight f6, as I say, is answered by the excellent move here, bishop d3. And this really does take advantage of the clumsy position of the white pieces. Obviously, if white takes with the rook on d3, queen takes e4 is very good for black indeed. Somehow the white pieces on d3, e3 and c2 are all in very poor positions. It may be best for white to flick in knight f6 check, but after bishop takes f6, rook takes d3 and now queen e4, the key move, once again white is in a mess. All his pieces are tripping over each other's toes and black has a definite advantage. So that's why, going back to the game, 𝐶𝐫𝐽 plays c4, but black now plays bishop b7 and the threat of knight e4 has been prevented. So rook d to b1. Alright, a6. Keeping the white rook out of b5. That was certainly white's plan there. Rook b5 and then rook a b1. So white has to find another way of doubling rooks on the file, and black doubles rooks likewise on the d file. So white doubles on the b file, rook fd8. Knight comes back to f1, and now the bishop comes to f8. Obviously there's no future for the bishop on g7 for the time being, so black repositions his bishop, intending perhaps to move his queen at the right moment. Rook b6. Well, black prepared for that. Queen c8, queen b2, and now black moves his bishop into e4. So still absolutely everything okay for black, no problems. Rook comes down to b8, not very dangerous. White takes on d8, and black recaptures with the queen. Rook e1, bishop a8, queen comes to f2, and black defends his c-pawn with queen to c7. Knight d2, and now queen c6. Again, thinking very much about the idea of stopping knight e4, and en passant, attacking the pawn on a4, which actually is very difficult to protect. Now white makes a mistake. I think this is the first position in the game, and this is quite a common phenomenon, where black is actually threatening something directly. At these moments, especially if you think you've been in charge of the game, there's a tendency to blunder, because it's almost as if the tables have been turned psychologically during the game, and now you're the one under pressure instead of the one exerting the pressure. White played bishop b3. As I say, I'm not sure there was an entirely comfortable way of defending that pawn. I can't actually see a logical way to defend that pawn. And once the pawn goes, of course, then black's got his own very strong passed pawn, which later on could become a decisive factor. But bishop b3 is an outright blunder. Rook takes d2. Queen takes d2, knight takes b3, and of course once that knight returns from the dead on the side of the board, he can come into the centre. And now white, of course, is lost. Black's bishop and queen battery on the long diagonal is exceptionally powerful, and now white's got a knight to worry about to boot. Well, queen f2, white's getting desperate, the a-pawn goes, he takes on d4, queen takes d4, and now queen c2, polishes white off very effectively. White resigns. There's no way to defend g2. If he plays queen f2, bishop c5 is the end of the game. So a pretty thematic game by black there, who managed to execute his opening plan in comfort. He developed good counterplay throughout the game, and he hit the white centre at the right time with c5. So that's Larsson's queen d7. Let's go on to look at a few more games with this interest. My next game comes from the Gibraltar Masters tournament, played in 2009, between Delrio Angelis, who's graded 2.532, and Grandmaster Michael Royce, who's graded 2.647. It's another interesting example of Larsson's counter to the exchange Grunfeld, where, as we've seen, white plays his knight to e2 for aggressive reasons, intending to launch his f-pawn up the board at the right moment, and also to take the sting out of black's typical pinning move in the Grunfeld, bishop out to g4. So I'm recommending queen d7 in this position. Once again, the plan to slowly develop the queen side and then to attack white's centre with c5. We note that h4 aggressive attempts against the black king side rebound in this position due to black's idea of queen to g4. So Delrio Angelis castled. We know what to do against this. We develop our queen side solidly with b6. And now white deploys his pieces slightly differently to the French fellow in the last game with bishop e3, bishop b7, and now knight g3. I guess with this move, white is keeping his options open with his queen, and he's certainly thinking about launching an attack with the f-pawn as soon as he can. Well, knight c6. Now, I should also mention here the possibility of e5. This is less common, but I would say in a position of this type, it's a possibility to consider. If you go e5 and white responds with d5, then black's intention will be to put his knight on a5 and then to chip away at white's pawns with c6. This attack on the white centre is rare in the Grunfeld. I mean, normally black goes with c5, but it is a possibility to consider. So, with that on the table, white decides to play a rather unusual move here, bishop b5. And the idea is to force a slight concession. White's threatening d5, attacking the pinned knight. And after a6, white retreated his bishop to e2, and now black's queenside pawn structure has a slightly less solid feel to it, and white will be hoping to attack perhaps on the b file and maybe go to work against those weakened queenside pawns as the game continues. Okay, it's an interesting possibility. To counter it, black just centralised his pieces. He played his pawn up to e6, restraining white's centre. White played queen to d2, and now rook a d8 was played. Rook a d1, and now knight comes to a5. Well, once the queen's on d2, playing a rook to d8 makes perfect sense, putting the rook on the same file as the queen. And now I would say black's idea is either to put his queen on c6 or play his queen out to a4, followed by bringing this knight on a5 back into the game on c4. White has to demonstrate some sort of counterplay against this plan. Please also note that if white launches his attack with f4 here, black may consider countering that with f5. This is quite a common idea in the Grunfeld and blocks white's path to a kingside attack. So again, white can't see any clear way forward and switches plans with rook b1. I think that's a prophylactic move directed against black's plan of queen a4, after which white would play rook b4. So black plays queen c6 anyway, getting the queen on the long diagonal, and white now play rook b4. So what's white's plan in this position? Well, I think it's something like c4 and then d5. So again, black plays very actively to forestall all this and hits at the white centre with f5. And that in itself is a logical move, because it emphasises black's control of the long diagonal. Black's got queen and bishop there pointed dangerously down at g2, so white has to be careful that black doesn't leave it open the diagonal for those pieces. Well, white played bishop f3. Queen d6, of course the position of that bishop on f3 is a slight victory for black in itself, because now the f-pawn is obstructed. So white is trying to win this game by positional means. He's trying to force concessions all the time. And after bishop g5, he's putting the question to the rook on d8. But now black hits with the thematic Grunfeld move, c5. As I said, indispensable at most stages of the opening, or as here, even into the early middle game, black hits at the white centre. And that looks good because it both attacks the rook and the pawn on d4. Well, white retreated his rook, and black played rook d7, getting his own rook out of the firing line. White played e5, queen c7, and there was an exchange of light square bishops. Well, now perhaps we see the far-sightedness of white's early probe with bishop b5, because the black queen side, again, has a slightly less solid feel to it than it would otherwise do if the pawn was on a7. Nevertheless, black should have enough counterplay against white's centre, and he musters counterplay by bringing his knight into c4 and then pushing his pawn up to b5. a4. Looks as though white might have overlooked something after c takes d4, c takes d4, and knight takes e5, but all along white was intending queen e3 against this procedure, and that will regain the pawn, as now the knight must move, and now white gets to take on e6. Nevertheless, black's game is compact. He's got perhaps slightly the better of things in terms of pawn structure, and so he angles to exchange the queens. But with careful play here, one feels that white should be able to keep the balance. At any rate, it's only black who's playing for the advantage in this position, and well, white has to play carefully to steer this game towards a draw. g5 was played, threatening f4. White protects that advance against that advance with g3. Rook comes to the open file. Rook takes a4. In comes the black rook to c2. Rook e1 protecting the knight. a5, king f1, bishop f8. Black offers draw, and white accepts. I think that's a reasonable offer from black, and white has got no reason to be playing on in this position. If anything, he's the one who's slightly worse. So another one of those games where white tried to probe black's position throughout, but failed to find a chink of light, and black had plenty of decent counterplay for virtually all of this game. So no dangers there for black, and another vindication of Llārsson's early queen move. The nice thing about Llārsson's variation with queen d7 is that by comparison with a lot of the other main lines against the exchange variation, there is less to learn. This economic approach to chess theory cannot be underestimated for the needs of the average player, who really hasn't got the time or the energy to study main lines, or at least main lines which extend to move 20 and beyond, and which require an Olympian memory to master. No, Llārsson's queen d7 is a pretty good way for black to play, and should give you good results without the expenditure of enormous amounts of energy. Which brings me to my final game in our little discussion, which is a game between the American international master Mark Deason and the Turkish grandmaster Suat Atalık. And this game was played in the USA back in the year 2000. And here, white decided to play f3 in place of castles. Now, that's an interesting move because it prevents black from playing queen g4. So I wonder whether white is intending in this position to follow up with the hyper-aggressive h4. Well, black intercepts this straight away with a strike on the white centre. And so if white wants to play h4, in this particular position, he's going to be exposing himself to extreme risk because black is able to open up the game straight away and hit at d4. The ability to do this really should dissuade white from playing that early h4 move because black's counterplay against the centre is simply too strong. So after c5, an excellent move as played in the game, decent change tack and castled, whereupon 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼 brought his knight out to c6. And play now started to develop normally after bishop e3, knight a5, bishop d3, black took on d4, and now he put his pawn up to b6. So perhaps in this line black has been enticed into taking on d4 slightly earlier than normal, but white has played f3, which, as I say, is perhaps a little bit sluggish under the circumstances. Well, decent played naturally. He played rook to c1. He could also have tried rook to b1. That's a common enough move in this line, perhaps giving white the option of playing bishop b5 as and when necessary. But black's development isn't really hindered in any way after bishop b7 and then, say, rook fc8. With the idea of knight c4, black is in good shape. And if white plays rook fc1, well, already black is thinking about maybe exchanging off the rooks and then rook c8. Something like this in the Grunfeld is quite a good idea because one nice feature of Grunfeld positions is the queenside pawn majority for black. As the game progresses, this majority tends to become stronger and stronger. And with each exchange of pieces, black comes closer to the desired endgame, where possibly the queenside pawn majority could be a decisive feature of the position. It's an aspect of exchange Grunfeld positions which, again, you've always got to keep in mind. Going back to the game, white decided to play rook c1, and black played e6. White played f4, which, you know, okay, I can see the attraction of this move, but having played f3, I wonder whether it's sensible to play f4, and black answered with bishop b7. Already, black could have considered playing f5. I think this is a typical way to put the brakes on white's advances on the king side, and black is certainly threatening to take over light squares with bishop b7 now. So maybe d5, but then f takes e4, bishop takes e4, now bishop b7, and the pawn on d5 is not long for this world. So, I mean, it could be after f4 that f5 is a good move. Bishop b7 was played, and of course this is very provocative because it entices white to play f5, which is exactly what 𝐷𝐶𝐹 did. So how should black meet this aggressive white advance? Well, having played e6, it would be foolish not to take advantage of the option of opening the e-file, and 𝐼𝐼𝐼 played logically. He took on f5 with the pawn, and then he played rook fe8, attacking the loose bishop on e3. So if you can get a development moving like this for free, why not do it? Queen d2, and now rook a d8 was played. I mean, actually, as the game goes, maybe rook a c8 would have been a little bit better, when I think black is actually the driving seat here. Nevertheless, rook a d8 was played, and white parked his king on h1. I mean, white could have tried doubling his rooks up on the f-file here, with rook f2, and then rook cf1. Well, black can play knight c4 anyway. White's got to take that. But now, of course, black has this seriously strong dark square bishop, and perhaps he can emphasise the power of that bishop, even if white comes in and tries to strip out the defenders of the king with bishop d5. Black has the better pawn structure here, and he's safely covering f7. So, black for choice. In the game, white went king h1, and black possibly admitted his slight error on the last move by playing rook c8. White moves in with bishop h6, and black plays queen d5, threatening checkmate. Rook f2 defending, off comes the rook on c1, and now black plays bishop takes d4. Obviously this is quite a risky move, as it clearly allows white attacking chances on the dark squares around black's king, but 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼 figures, well, with bishop d5, I can repel all borders and keep my light squares together. Actually, black set a little trap here. White took on g6, and now if bishop takes g6, f takes g6 and rook f8, which looks dangerous initially, I think black can simply take that and go king h7, when it all seems to be holding together, and black is, for his own part, threatening checkmate on the back rank. So white decided to play bishop g5, clearly with the idea of putting that bishop on f6. Black has to intercept that quickly, and 𝐼𝐼𝐼 does this by putting pressure on the bishop at d3, and after bishop takes c4, taking with the queen. Alright, queen a1. Queen d4, very tempting move, both defending on the dark squares and hitting the rook on f2. Queen f1, what else? And now black brings his queen to e5, intending judicious exchanges after queen e1. h4. Okay, well, that was perhaps necessary to protect the bishop, but it also introduces attacking options with the possibility of h5 at the right moment. f5. Well, the trouble for black was that queen e1 was answered by rook takes f7. That holds the fort for white and regains the pawn lost. But maybe queen e6 was better, and well, with the idea of reintroducing the knight into the game via knight c4, followed by the advance of the queenside majority, this should be fairly comfortable for black in terms of defending the king and exploiting gradually the advantage of the extra pawn. But f5 was played, and now white in turn makes perhaps a slight error by playing queen a6. I think white has got to realise the seriousness of his plight here and push forward with h5. I think after h5, g takes h5, rook takes f5, queen e1, white now has a drawing mechanism after rook f8, and this is definitely what white should have done, and then rook f7. I think it's perpetual check on the f-file here, because after king g6, we can even go rook f6 check. And I don't think the black king can evade the checks. If he takes on g5, well, we've got rook f5 check, and perpetual check all the way down the f-file. I think white should certainly have availed himself of this window of opportunity, because after queen e6, queen d4, rook f3, knight c6, and now knight e5, black is certainly better again. He's re-centralised his knight, and he's able to force off the queens to reach a winning endgame after queen d7. All the queens came off. So how easy is it for black to win this position? Well, what are the factors favouring him? I mean, he's got an extra pawn. His king is slightly weakened, but, you know, white's king is further away from the centre. Black's got options of rook e2 at his disposal. He's got knight c5 coming, followed by knight e4. I would say this should be a fairly comfortable win for black, but not quite resignable for white. And this is exactly what happens. 𝐷𝐶𝐹 doesn't resign. He tries to bring his pieces into active positions to try and create some counterplay, but black is easily able to frustrate him. Now it's just a question of how do we get those queenside pawns going? Well, king h2. Now, some people might just snap that bishop off. And of course, this should be pretty good for black. But, first of all, he has to defend the second rank. And secondly, the pawn on g5 is very restricting from black's point of view. White's got the more active rook, and it's difficult for black to get his king into the game because the king is tied down to the defence of g6. So that's why 𝐼𝐼𝐼 does not exchange the bishop at this point. Instead, he carefully defends the 7th rank. He activates his rook. And then, after bishop c3, he offers the exchange of rooks. Now, could white do better than bishop c3? Well, he could try bishop e5. And after rook d5, try bishop b8. But now rook a5. I think this is really the writing on the wall for white, as his rook is forced passive. And now black gets to regroup his own knight. Eventually, those queenside pawns are going to advance. It's just a question of regrouping to get the best positions for your pieces. And this is what black has achieved here. Well, bishop c3 was played, rook c7. Now, of course, it's quite a lot easier. The rooks came off. White tried king h3. Well, when I first saw this game, I thought that must be crazy, why not king g3? Well, now black can just bring his pieces into the game. And once those pawns start going, it should be a win. Yeah, I don't see any possibility to hold this position for white. It really does look pretty grim. For instance, if black-white plays h5 in this position, black just sends the white king to Coventry there. He brings his knight into b4, attacking the pawn. This drives in turn the white bishop passive, and now white's king can make inroads into the queen side. With the black's king can make inroads into the white queen side, with the white king too far away. So that would be one winning procedure. In the game after king h3, well, the writing's on the wall. Black eventually gets to bring his king in. Up we come. Bishop comes down to b8. Well, this helps black because white can. This helps black because he can, configure the queenside pawns to his own specifications. In comes the white knight. King comes to d3. White is being further and further forced back. He goes g4. Well, if you play bishop a3 trying to hold the fort, now here's a typical example of the win. a4, bishop a5, holding up the pawns. The pawns cannot be stopped in the long run. Well, what's white to do here? He's got to try some sacrifice and hope that he can rush with king g5. Knight takes a2, king takes g6, a3. White is not on time. Going back to the game, g4 was played, f3, king g3, king e2. White resigned. The f pawn is not to be stopped. So, going back and summarising, run through the opening moves again. Right, in the bishop c4 line, white's plan is to bring the knight to e2. This is economical development of the knight and liberates the f pawn. Black in turn, my recommendation is to play Larsson's move queen d7. This is the introduction to a development plan involving b6, bishop b7, knight c6, knight a5, and then c5. If white wants to lash out on the king side with h4, he gets rebuffed with queen g4. In this year of 2009, I don't see any clear way for white to develop an advantage against queen d7, and simply by mastering the information on this DVD, you will have a massive head start over most of your opponents, who probably will never have faced queen d7 before. So that's it. Let's move on to another 𝐿𝐥𝐽-Grunfeld system. Now we have to consider those 𝐿𝐥𝐽-Grunfeld systems where white puts his knight on f3. The game under consideration is from the 𝐵𝐼𝐾𝐧𝐼 tournament in 1999, and playing white in this game, American Grandmaster Aleksej Yurmolinski, playing black, the legendary Garry Kasparov. And by transposition, we've reached one of the main lines, where in place of bishop c4, white has basically gone knight f3, and black has reacted to that with the immediate c5. Against all knight f3 systems, I recommend that black play c5 very quickly, as he's able, in many lines, to pin that knight with bishop g4, which intensifies the pressure against d4. The first system I want to consider is a line originally played and perfected by English Grandmaster Tony Miles, bishop e3. Essentially, with this move, white is trying to find the most efficient way of consolidating his centre. Usually, he intends to play rook c1. That was how Miles interpreted the variation in the early days. For instance, if black went knight c6, white would go rook c1, and white is on time with the move d5. As black brings the pressure against d4 to a height, so white plays d5. I basically recommend avoiding this position for black, as quite often white can get a very dominating centre. So going back to the position after bishop e3, we're going to stick with the tried and trusted move queen a5, which is generally thought to be the best antidote to this system by white. The queen on a5 puts immediate pressure on c3 and forces a slight concession, in that if white plays rook c1, he's got to worry about the fate of his a pawn. So generally white plays queen d2, as 𝐆𝐫𝐼𝐼 plays here, and now bishop g4, which ups the ante against the white centre. If Kasparov plays this move, even though it was a decade ago, you can guarantee the move's quality. Well, 𝐆𝐫𝐼𝐼 continues thematically with rook c1, and now it's important to take this knight straight away to damage the white pawn structure. This makes it difficult for white to find a truly safe haven for his king. And Kasparov now played pawn up to e6, which, well, basically consolidates the central position and prepares to castle. And now 𝐆𝐿 played d5, which is tempting, but I'm a little bit unsure about allowing black's fianchetto bishop into the game. Now going back, perhaps white could do better with rook b1. The point of this is to threaten both rook b5 and rook takes b7. So black must get on the case immediately by taking on d4, taking on d2, luring the white king into the centre, and now the thematic castles. Black sacrifices a pawn in order to counterattack against the centre and to expose the white king. So after knight c6, white cannot really hold his pawn. If he goes d5, well, black was threatening rook d8. Black takes and plays rook fd8, and it's so difficult for white to hold this position together. If he plays king c1, we go rook takes d5, bishop c4, and then rook f5, defending f7. Meanwhile, if he goes rook b5, this is a very clumsy square for the rook, and black can play knight d4, which more or less forces the exchange of bishop for knight. White really doesn't want to have to surrender that dark square bishop, but he hasn't got much choice, and this position is at least equal for black, despite white's extra pawn. The bishop is dominating, and white's pawn structure is ragged. Going back once more to the position after e6, as in the game, and now we're looking at rook b1. Black takes on d4, takes on d2, castles, and now how about e5, trying to jam in the black bishop. Well, then comes rook d8, threatening bishop takes e5, and if f4, knight c6 again hits the pawn on d4. In case you're worried about having to remember a lot, I assure you all these moves are very logical. Black is attacking the pawn on d4 after all. So white defends, rook d7, bishop g2, and now rook c8, with a fairly comfortable game. So, which brings us all the way back to the game, and 𝐆𝐿 move d5. Well, Kasparov wasted no time destroying that pawn and weakening the white pawn chain, and now he developed his knight d7. White went c4, and black went queen b6. With the white king stuck in the middle, exchanging queens makes life for white a little bit too easy. Generally, white's pawn structure is so poor that he has problems finding a safe haven for his king, and Kasparov is very willing to trade on that in the next few moves. As 𝐆𝐿 tries to find a haven for his king after bishop h3, of course black blocks that bishop out of the game and castles, but after queen d6, clearly this position is favouring black. Well, white went bishop f4. It's tempting. Black played bishop e5, and now white pinned the bishop with rook e1. Looks dangerous, but Kasparov wasn't worried. He trusts in the integrity of his pawn structure to hold his game together, and is able even to castle on the queen side, which is a very rare occurrence indeed in the exchange Grunfeld. Liquidation on e5 followed. Black's threatening knight takes f3 check, and white defended with queen c3, which also keeps the queen out of the range of the knight for a few moves, which could be useful in tactical terms. Rook he8, protecting the knight. Rook e3 threatening to double up, and now queen f6, setting a little trap en passant. If white mistakenly doubles on the e-file, black crunches home with knight takes f3 check, which actually wins material. So, going back to the game, after queen f6, white decided to play f4. Black went knight g7, and after bishop g2, we got an exchange of queens, and now black moved his knight to f6, taking control of light squares in the centre. Again, I should stress that white's life in this endgame is not especially easy, as the black knight is so versatile. Well, 𝐸𝐺𝐵𝐿INSKY played his bishop to f3, controlling the knight to a degree, and Kasparov traded the rook. F takes e3. Well, I suppose if white took with the rook on e3, black would have played rook e8. And this is a difficult position for white, with black's king in the endgame threatening to invade on the queen side, and the knight easily able to transfer to the dream square on d6. For instance, you could just imagine if black trades rooks, Kasparov moving his knight to d6, and now white is in all sorts of trouble. So, 𝐸𝐺𝐵𝐿INSKY plays f takes e3. Rook d6, rook a3, king b8, a little bit of consolidatory play, and now rook to b3. It may well have been that 𝐸𝐺𝐵𝐿INSKY could have played rook a5 in this position, and now knight d7 is interesting, threatening rook b6, and if e4, we go f takes e4, bishop takes e4, rook f6. So it really isn't that easy for white to actually break out from this position, because his pawn structure and his bishop are both so poor. So back at the game, white played rook b3, rook a6, a3, and now comes the transfer of that knight to the dream square, d6. Up came the knight, bishop d3, and now rook comes into a4, driving white completely passive after rook c3. And now it's a question of whether black can actually intensify or increase his advantage. Well, Kasparov played king c7, white played king f2, and now came b5. So black has clear ideas of activating his position here, and now brings his rook into the game along the fourth rank. Well, what can white play? He's under pressure 3 times on c4. He's got to take on b5, and now black plays the excellent move king b6. Suddenly, there are 2 white pawns on pre, and after king e3, black has c4 first, before taking on b5. Everything comes with gain of tempo in this endgame, and suddenly, black's attacking not only the rook, but the pawn at a3. So white's got to exchange the rooks in essence, and go in for a very poor endgame here, after knight takes c3. Obviously white's task in this endgame is very difficult to draw. His bishop's attacked immediately. Black's threatening moves like king c5, he's threatening knight takes d5. I would say king c5 is the move highest on black's agenda here, and white doesn't have a very enviable task. 𝐸𝐺𝐵𝐿INSKY played bishop e8. Now he could have played bishop c2 perhaps, then certainly comes king c5, and the idea is now to sacrifice this pawn with d6 in order to get the king to d4. Turns out after knight b5 check, white's problem is that he can't take on c4, because knight takes a3 wins straight away. So going back to this pawn sacrifice, after king takes d6, white's got to try f5, attempting to liquidate as many pawns as possible. Black isn't interested in the exchange, he plays g5, and now probably threatens h5. So if f6, h5 anyway. And again, this position is problematic for white. Black has a passed pawn on c4. He's got a strongly placed knight. King d4 is failing as before to knight b5 check. And black threatens king e6. Really, the passed pawn in this position isn't going anywhere. And bishop g6 is answered by knight d5 check, king d4, and now black has knight takes f6. Again, with a fairly easy position to win here after, for instance, g4. So let's go back to the game and bishop e8. King c5 was played. Pawn to d6, knight d5 check, king e4, knight f6 check, king e3, and now king takes d6. Note, definitely not knight takes e8 in this position, when after d7, the tables are completely turned. Well, knight f6 check, king e3, it's pretty clear that king takes d6 is now winning, because black's attacking the bishop and the pawn on c4. So after bishop f7, king c5, the game didn't last much longer. Black has essentially consolidated. White win h4, knight g4 check, king d2, if king e4, knight h6, bishop e6, knight f5, h5, knight g3 check. So king d2 was played, king d4, h5, off comes the pawn, and now knight f6. White resigned. Essentially, he's got two weaknesses. His two weaknesses are both the black passed pawns. Therefore, after, for instance, bishop f3, black simply trundles the h pawn all the way up the board and eventually plays knight e4 check with an easy win, followed by knight g3. So an excellent game there by Kasparov, very Grunfeld-like and thematic in its quality, and shows us that the system, Miles's system with knight f3 and bishop e3, should be met by queen a5. We continue our investigation of this system where white plays knight f3 followed by bishop e3, with the next game, 𝐆𝐫𝐻 versus 𝐵𝐼𝐻, played in the 𝐵IL Grandmaster Tournament in 2002. Again, after bishop e3, black attacked the pawn on c3 with queen a5, and this time white played bishop d2, a rarer and probably inferior move to queen d2. I once played this move against Murray Chandler with the white pieces, more out of ignorance than anything else, because I didn't like the position after queen d2 with the queens coming off, but maybe it turns out that after queen d2 bishop g4 is even stronger, as played by Kasparov. Nevertheless, bishop d2 makes a clumsy impression. I mean, you don't really want to play your bishop to e3 and then your bishop back to d2. But I suppose White's arguing that the queen on a5 is slightly misplaced, should he ever be able to, for instance, play d5 and c4. Well, in this game, 𝐵𝐻 attacks the white centre very thematically by playing bishop out to g4. And pressure against the white centre is already starting to intensify. Korchnoi castled, and black played rook d8, taking advantage for the moment of the fact that white can't play d5 because c3 would be hanging after that. Already I think black has a more than satisfactory game. He's got pressure against the white pawn chain, and with knight c6 to come, this should be easy for black to claim at least equality. Well, Korchnoi played knight g5. There was an exchange of bishops on e2, and now black played queen a6. Black is quite happy to encourage an exchange of queens in this position, because he understands that the endgame coming up after d5 and now the excellent c4 will be very good for him. With c4, black's intending to introduce his knight into the game on c5 and then to get his queenside pawn majority going. So if black can find time for, say, let's say knight c5 and then b5, he'd be in very good shape. And Korchnoi moves to intercept this with bishop e3. Now, if black plays bishop takes c3, white's going to go rook c1 and recapture the loose pawn on c4. So instead of that, 𝐵𝐻 plays rook a c8, which I think is a much better move. Yes, white does get the chance to take on a7, but now after bishop takes c3, the pawn on c4 is protected. This could be a very important trump card in black's hand. Well, in fact, it's the winning trump card as the game progresses, but it takes really excellent play by 𝐵𝐻 to prove it. Because Korchnoi is incredibly tenacious, and with his huge experience of chess, he should be able to put up serious resistance in this position, which is not yet lost, but of course it is worse for white, due to black's queenside pawn majority. So white gets his bishop out of jail, with black probably threatening b5, and a discovered attack against a7. And black just retreats with bishop g7. Rook comes to b5 to take away knight c5, and black pushes the pawn down to c2 as a distraction. Now Korchnoi plays rook c1, which is passive looking. I must admit, I thought e5 would have been the move here, blocking the Fianchetto bishop out of the game, but it turns out now that rook c4 is very strong for black. Black is threatening knight to b4, and if rook to c1, knight b4 wins straight away. Let's go back. Problem with e5, it also weakened d5, so some sort of lousy move like a3 would just be very, very passive for white, and black could increase the pressure with moves such as rook to c3, and if bishop c1, knight c5. Black is improving his position methodically, and white is running out of active moves. So, in the game, this is why Korchnoi played rook c1. Black plays rook c4 anyway, a3, h6, knight f3, and the difference between this variation and the last is, of course, the pawn on e4 is on pre. 𝐾𝐲𝐲 gave up the pawn deliberately, a desperate step to get his pieces coordinated, but Smirin is able to consolidate this position after rook c3, rook b2. This is obviously 𝐾𝐲𝐲's intention. Rook takes a3, rook takes c2, and now knight b4. h6 was useful not only to push the knight back, but to create a bolt hole for the king, and all 𝐾𝐲𝐲 can do here is to play rook d1 and hope to get rid of his weakness now, the weak d pawn, by playing d6 at the right moment. Well, black started moving in for the kill now with knight d3 and played knight takes f4. Poor Victor 𝐾𝐲𝐲 is really struggling. 2 pawns down with an exposed king. It's hard to see him coming back from here. And indeed, after the excellent move rook d3, black was well on the way to consolidation. White tried rook b8, rook b4, rook e8, bishop f6, rook d8, and now came knight c5. White pushed the pawn on, pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn, hitting the bishop, bishop g7. The time has come now to play safely. Rook e6 was played, there was a check, a further check. By these means, black improves the position of his rook, and now g5. This in essence is the winning move, because it will force the white knight to a worse square, and at the same time prepare g3, after which white's kingside falls apart. 𝐾𝐲𝐲 resigned. So a very good game by Smirin there all the way through, which emphasised to me how important it is in the Grunfeld to keep active, to hit at the white centre and to keep active throughout. As we saw here, even in a long endgame, the great Victor 𝐾𝐲𝐲 was unable to hold the game simply because his pieces were passively placed. Very good chess by Smirin, and illustrates that bishop d2 is really a damp squib back on the ninth move. We now come to quite an important variation, a line which has become all the rage for Grunfeld players over the last 20-30 years. That's where white plays knight f3 and then rook b1. Rook b1 exerts a serious influence on the black queen side and ties down the bishop on c8. White uses the fact that black is a little bit tied down to accelerate his development. Generally in this system, if black does nothing, white follows up with simple moves such as bishop e2, castles, bishop e3, queen d2, and eventually bishop h6. Black generally struggles to find an effective plan of development against this scheme unless he does something very active. So I'm recommending the main line here with castles, bishop e2, take on d4, and then go queen a5 check. I think this is the reliable way, and it forces white to play precisely with bishop d2, queen takes a2, and castles if he wants to maintain any type of advantage. White has been forced to sacrifice a pawn in this line. Will he get enough compensation for it? Well, in fact, I'm recommending here that black doesn't try and keep the pawn. There are all sorts of moves which consolidate here. Moves such as, for instance, queen e6, which has been played. I've even seen the brazen a5 played here. But in each of these lines, white gets good compensation, in view of the time it takes black to get his development completed. So I'm going to recommend a very Grunfeld-like move here, a move which has been played by Vishy Anand, the reliable move bishop g4. I think this is the best way, re-sacrificing the pawn on b7 if white wants to take it in order to get developed. And with bishop g4, black starts to mount thematic pressure against the white centre. Now the first game I'm going to show you is rather encouraging. It's a bit of a disaster for white, who plays all manner of natural moves, but ends up getting chalked up very easily. It's the game Martin Mathisen, 2291, versus Mikkel Antonsen, 2450, played in the Danish Championship in April 2009. And in this particular game, white contented himself with a straightforward move, rook takes b7. I doubt this gives black any trouble at all, and Antonsen took on f3 and then took on d4, remaining a pawn up for the time being, but white's idea is that he wants to go bishop g5, uncovering a double attack on the bishop at d4 and the pawn on e7, and at the same time he keeps his rook active on b7. If e5 came, black's rook on a8 might well become embarrassed. So black plays e5 himself, cementing the position of the bishop on d4 and just threatening to get his pieces out really with knight c6. So white's got to continue with forcing play. He plays queen c1, and in order to get his pieces out, black plays knight a6. And the idea behind knight a6 is just to go, for instance, knight c5 and then a5, some sort of consolidatory sequence like that. So white thought to himself, right, I've got to continue with forcing moves here. He played his bishop into e7. Rook f e8 was played, and now white played bishop g4. All right, with bishop d7 coming up, perhaps, rook a b8 was played, and white moved his queen into c6, suspecting absolutely nothing. Imagine his absolute surprise when black played rook takes e7 here. And that, I can just imagine, came as an incredible shock to white. The point is that after rook takes e7, Anderson played the absolute cruncher here, queen takes f2. And white had nothing other than to resign this position. Obviously, if rook takes f2, rook comes down the back, and checkmate follows. Now, if we just go back to rook takes e7, could white have done better? Well, he can take on b8 check, knight takes b8, and then possibly play queen c8 check. But after king g7, queen takes b8, and then, for instance, just simply a5, black remains a pawn up for nothing. So it just goes to show, in this variation, after bishop g4, white just can't continue to make straightforward moves. Black has tricks of his own, based on the demolition of d4. So white must surely do better than this. The next game is state of the art in the rook b1 variation. It comes from the Moscow Tau Memorial Tournament, played in November 2009, playing white Vladimir Kramnik, playing black Viswanathan Anand. And, as I said, it's a rook b1 where black plays bishop g4. Wheeling through the moves again, we see that white is trying to find the most effective way of mobilising his queenside pieces. With bishop e3, not especially effective, so he turns his attention to rook b1, freezing the black queenside for the time being, and hoping to buy enough time just to get white's pieces out, and then go to work with his central pawn majority. That's the basis of any white advantage that might occur in the exchange variation. Can white get the central pawn majority going? And in particular, the d pawn. We often see a pass white d pawn in the exchange Grunfeld. Well, we're trying to find the best way to steer a course around this idea. Well, okay, we castle. White can't play d5 just yet because c3 hangs beyond, so bishop e2 is the main line, and now black takes on d4 and plays queen a5 check. Queen d2 leads to absolutely nothing for white. Black would, for instance, take the queens off and then play knight c6 with a very safe game after, for instance, knight c6 and then bishop g4. So white almost always plays bishop d2, sacrificing this pawn. And now we're recommending after castles to play the straightforward move bishop g4. Well, we've seen that rook takes b7 came a cropper in the last game, so Kramnik played the main line, bishop g5. And Anand played a cunning move here, h6. The point of this move is that if white executes his so-called threat after bishop takes e7, black gets all his pieces out after, for instance, rook f e8, rook takes b7, and now knight c6. Rather than buy a pawn, black has actually re-sacrificed the pawn in order to get coordinated. And now, with e4 on pre beyond the bishop, black has a knight active game. So, Kramnik keeps up the pressure with bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and now Anand plays knight to c6. White goes d5, and now rook a d8. Rook takes b7, and now e6. In case you're worried about having a lot to remember here, all these moves are thematic. We're bombarding the d4 pawn, well, the d5 pawn now, and forcing it forward. Well, white played bishop c7, which hitherto had scored very well for him. But now Anand unleashes a novelty, bishop takes f3. Hitherto, the exchange sacrifice, e takes d5, bishop takes d8, d takes e4, bishop e7, and now rook e8 was coming up very badly after bishop b5. Actually, it may be in this line after bishop e7 that knight takes e7 and then taking on f3 could be okay for black. For instance, in this position, black can go a5. He's got a bishop and a strong passed pawn. It won't be at all easy for white to consolidate this. But, of course, the best that black can hope for from this type of position is a draw. Nevertheless, after bishop c7, Anand found a clearer way. He took on f3, and then he played rook d7. And the point of all this is that if white goes d6, black plays queen a6 attacking the rook, rook b1, and then moves his knight into d4. I think this way round, black may well be willing to sacrifice the exchange with a well-timed rook takes d6. It's a slightly different position to last time. Again, black only has a knight and pawn for the exchange, but his knight is very strong. Opposite colour bishops remain on the board, and white's bishop on f3 is not especially impressive. So black is basically okay in this position. Hence, going back to rook d7, Kramnik decides to sacrifice his queen with d takes c6. But Anand steers the game very skillfully into a good position after rook takes d1 and then queen c2. White played bishop d6, hoping to get his c-pawn rolling, but everything was under control. After g4, very good, decoying the bishop off the diagonal, bishop takes d4, and now black gets a chance to destroy the passed pawn with queen takes c6. Obviously white is very active. Queen b6, he would have to be, as he's a queen for rook and bishop down. Alright, rook d8, very good. Please note, if rook c8 in this position, white has bishop h5, opening up fire against f7. So rook d8 was played, bishop c7, rook takes d7, bishop takes b6, and now after an exchange on d1 and an exchange on b6, Kramnik played king f1 and offered a draw. So that is the latest thinking in the bishop g4 line. It may well be that the way Anand played this game, we've so far learned how crucially important it is to keep active for black in the Grunfeld, and you may need to sacrifice on occasion in order to do this. A typical example of a Grunfeld sacrifice occurs in the following game, the game between Boris Gelfand and Alexei Shirov, played in Odessa in 2007, and it features our old friend rook b1, with Shirov employing the recommended procedure of giving the check on a5, whipping off that pawn on a2, and then showing a willingness to re-sacrifice the pawn after bishop g4. We've seen bishop g5, we've looked at rook takes b7. Now another move, somewhat quieter, bishop e3, but no less potent. White simply protects the pawn on d4, and threatens rook takes b7. Well, it's very important for black, once again, to concentrate on getting the pieces out here, so Shirov played knight c6. After rook takes b7, I've no doubt at all that he's intending to go through with a move sequence something like rook d8 and then e6, which intensifies the pressure against d5. I mean, it may well be that rook fd8 is slightly more accurate, but you get the general idea. Going back then, after knight c6, Gelfand preferred d5, and this is what most top players play when they come to this position. That's a move with good and bad points about it. The good point is it drives black's knight to the edge of the board. The bad point is, of course, it opens up the diagonal for the bishop on g7. Well, white now played bishop g5, and it's a question of whether black can consolidate this position after b6, bishop takes e7, and rook fe8, which was answered by d6. Now comes the creative exchange sacrifice by Shirov, which every Grunfeld player must absorb into his or her makeup. You have to be willing to give up exchanges in a position like this, simply because the potential of that d-pawn is too great. Shirov played knight c6, white went bishop b5, and now black took on e7. So there are two ways now for white. In the game, Gelfand played 𝐵𝐶𝐽 h3. He could have taken on e8 straight away, And then after rook takes e8, d takes e7, black plays the accurate move, queen a3. The point of this is not only to open up fire against e7, but also f3. If white forces the pace with h3, black is willing to trade everything on f3 and play rook takes e7. And after rook fd1, bishop e5, king f1, the position's about equal. Black's strong passed pawn couplet on the queen side, plus his extra pawn and the entrenched bishop, provide ample compensation for the exchange. Now compare this with the game, as after h3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, black keeps the queens on with queen e6. After bishop takes e8, rook takes e8, d takes e7, rook takes e7, we reach what looks like a similar position to the last one, but in fact, this is a much better version for black. Because firstly, white's got to defend his e-pawn. He did this with rook fe1, and now black gets the chance to put his bishop into d4, which is an excellent square. So once again, the strong bishop plus the pawn duo on the queen side give white some problems in this position. What, of course, white needs to do is to mobilise his own pawn majority on the king side. But that's not so easy, with the bishop on d4 tying him down. 𝐵𝐵 played rook b d1, and after queen e5, he went rook d3. Now the pawns started to roll, as they must, to dissuade white from launching a direct attack against the white king with his extra exchange. After queen d1, Shirov's bishop sits quite nicely on c5, and now 𝐵𝐵 decided to play rook e2 to defend possible attacks against f2. There came rook e6, and after g3, Shirov went rook d6. He's happy to play an endgame the exchange down with those strong passed pawns. Well, off came the rooks. a4, rook d2, and now a3. Queen c4, hoping to hold up the pawns. King g7, rook d7, and now queen f6. Answering an attack with a counter-attack on f2. Well, f4. Looked like 𝐵𝐵 needed to win this game. He's thinking about the move e5, but it does look incredibly risky, this move f4, as it lets in Shirov's queen. King g4, h5. This could well have been polluted by time trouble. Certainly looks that way. g5 check. Extraordinary stuff. And now king g6. Absolutely typical Shirov play. Well, he's saying, you've got no useful checks, white, and I'm meanwhile mustering pressure against your king. White went queen c3. Black played f6. Rook came to d5. Well, of course, white could take the queens on f6, but he's got some problems with the a pawn. For instance, what happens after b5? There are certain problems holding those queenside pawns. So white went rook d5, black went a2, rook f5. Incredible move here, queen f4 check, unbelievable stuff. That's a quite brilliant move, because of course if rook takes f4, we have f takes g5 checkmate. If g takes f4, bishop f2 check, forcing queen g3. This is extraordinary stuff. Bishop takes g3, king takes g3, and 𝐵𝐵 resigned. A pawn is being queened on a1. So quite extraordinary stuff there, all the way through, and another state-of-the-art encounter in this line. For the time being, black's chances in the rook b1 variation seem good, thanks to 12 bishop g4. My last game in the rook b1 variation is an old game from St. Petersburg in 1992, but it's very thematic, and it shows a lot of black ideas against this variation. We are familiar now with the counter c5, getting castled, and taking off this pawn on a2 after bishop d2, queen takes a2, and then bishop g4. A logical move, exposing white's pawn on d4. And in Ivanov versus Lukin, St. Petersburg Open 1992, white played neither rook takes b7, bishop e3, nor bishop g5. He pushed forward in the centre with d5. And the biggest benefit of that is obvious. The knight is stopped from coming to c6. But 𝐿𝐿𝐵𝐾 continued with development, quite happy to return the pawn on b7 in order to get his pieces out. And after knight d7 and rook fb8, black was in good shape. Now white tried to keep control of the b file after queen b1. Black was happy to exchange rooks on b7, and now comes another very thematic move, knight c5. Black's getting active before white can consolidate. White would love nothing more than a gentle stroll at the board with his d-pawn all the way to d8, which he's hoping to be able to do after rook takes e7. However, after bishop f8, black is simply not giving him that time. Black's keeping very active. Black's got a nice trump in the guise of the passed a-pawn here, and after rook c7, looking good, had got his pawn back with knight takes e4. Now it's fairly easy for black to blockade that passed d-pawn, and the position is fizzling out. I mean, if white doesn't play very accurately in this position, he could easily be worse. So knight g5. I mean, a lot of your opponents might not find that move. The idea was that after knight takes d2, white has bishop takes g4, angling for an opposite colour bishop, some sort of endgame. Well, rook e8 was played, threatening back rank mate, g3, and now the point of rook e8 was to prepare bishop e7. Knight takes f7 was played, king takes f7, d6, and after knight e4, the two players agreed to a draw. There's got to be a trade on e7 now, as black's threatening knight takes d6, and after rook takes e7, rook takes e7, d takes, king takes. Black perhaps has a shade the better of things, but it should be a draw. So Ivanov and 𝐿𝐿𝐵𝐾 shook hands. So another one of those games where white got nothing against bishop g4. Just seems like a very good move. Right, moving on. Another one of those pesky exchange sacrifice systems which white might adopt against you is the system where white plays bishop e3 before knight f3, or bishop c4 for that matter, and his idea is to follow up c5 with queen to d2. This is another line where white is trying to find the best way of organising his queenside pieces, and in particular he doesn't define where he wants to put his rook yet on a1. The rook may come to b1, c1 or d1 according to circumstances. Only after that, when white has found the optimal deployment of that rook on a1, will white then develop his kingside pieces. In particular, he doesn't put his knight on g1 out on a limb, making him prey to the bishop on c8. So, what should black do against this? Well, queen a5 is recommended in a lot of books, but I'm going to stick with the tried and trusted Grunfeld plan of destroying white's centre and then attacking it with knight c6. Rook d1 is supposed to be the right way against this, which brings us to our first game, the game Malecki versus Yuri Vovk, 25-46. And this game was played in the Warsaw Rapid Tournament in December 2009. Black played bishop g4. Well, that's about as thematic as it gets in the Grunfeld, and there are two sensible moves for white, essentially. In the game Malecki versus Vovk, bishop e2 was played, and of course we're going to be looking at f3 next, which I think you could say is what a lot of people will play in this position. After that, that goes bishop d7. We'll be seeing an interesting example of that in the next game. But for the time being, let's have a look at bishop e2. Bishop takes e2, knight takes e2 was played, and now black played very specifically with knight a5, immediately introducing the threat of knight c4 and keeping out of range of white's d-pawn. White did not want that knight appearing on c4, so he tried rook c1, but now came b5. This is very thematic by black, as he prepares counterplay immediately without giving white time to castle. White's got to deal with the idea of knight c4, and he decided to do this by playing queen b4. Black defended the pawn with a6, and once again white was in something of a quandary here, because he doesn't really want to allow knight c4 in this position. So he decided to try and anticipate that with d5, knight c4, and then bishop d4, hoping to exchange off black's fianchetto bishop. This is another very good example of how one should keep as active as possible in the Grunfeld, and black struck with the move e5. The main point of this, obviously, is if white takes on e6, then bishop takes d4. It's very strong indeed. So Malecki played bishop c5, but after rook c8, he was kind of setting his pieces up for cheapos. He tried knight c3, bishop h6 was played, a very good active move, threatening bishop d2 check and the rook, and after rook d1, black played queen d7. Again, Wopke is working with tactics here. The main point of queen d7 is that Castles loses immediately to a5, decoying the white queen away from the protection of the bishop and winning instantly. So after queen d7, and with the threat of a5, Malecki was down to bishop e3, but after bishop takes e3 and then knight takes e3, his game was a complete wreck. And in fact, after rook a8, white resigned. That's a beautiful little game in many ways, because white played a whole host of natural moves, but it turned out that black's tactical control of the position was considerable, exchanging off those light square bishops, going for knight a5 to dominate the c4 square. White had real problems in this game. So to our next encounter with this cagey variation where white plays bishop e3 and queen d2. This is the game between Irina Krush and Bogdan Lalic, played in the Hastings tournament in the year 2000. You'll recall, against queen d2, I'm recommending that black destroy the white centre straight away, or at least attack it with knight c6, and try to force some concessions. And after rook d1, black goes bishop g4. And now I think, instead of bishop e2, white should play bishop f3, bishop d7, and then bishop b5, as Krush plays here. So what do we notice about this position? Okay, white has consolidated to a degree the d4 pawn. However, black has the traditional queenside pawn majority and comfortable squares for his pieces. After knight e2, Lalic played knight a5. It seems that the c4 square should be the focus for black pieces in this variation. After bishop takes d7, Lalic played the intermediary move, knight c4. And after queen c3, managed to take off the dark square bishop. Now after queen d7, only black can be better in this position. As more and more pieces come off, I should stress the queenside majority becomes stronger. White's main trump in this position is his central pawn majority. That's why in the exchange variation, white takes great pains to try and push these pawns up the board. For instance, with f4 and e5, he might, or she might, try to cramp the bishop on g7. So whilst this position looks very easy for black, with fluid development and the possibility of pushing those queenside pawns, this is exactly as happened in the game Krush against Lalic, black still has to be careful that the bishop on g7 doesn't get swamped by the advancing white pawns. Well, that's what Krush tried to do. Lalic played e6, restraining white's d pawn, and white played e5. Rook c4. Well, of course, what white would like to do now is to manoeuvre the knight to e4 to create pressure against d6, f6 and c5. Whatever black does has got to intercept that, as the knight started on his journey with knight c3. Well, Lalic played f6. A good move this, hitting at the centre. After rook fd1, there came b4, encouraging the knight to come to d4, and now came queen d5, relying that knight d6 could be answered by rook c3. Well, Krush played queen e4, and Lalic correctly took on e5. The queens came off, and now white was in something of a quandary. What she would have liked to have done would have been to take on e5 with the d pawn, opening up fire against d5. But then came rook takes f4, rook takes d5, and now rook c2. And the problem is, the threat of rook f2 is incredibly strong. So white's got to basically exchange a pair of rooks, and now it seems that black is in charge of the tactics here. After e6, bishop f8, blockading the pawn, knight e4, bishop e7, controlling the knight, and after rook d7, king f8. Basically, this position's winning for black as long as he can keep the white knight out. Well, rook b7 is about the best white can do here. Rook a6, rook b8, king g7, rook b7, rook takes e6, and black has beaten back white's initiative. So perhaps that's why in the game, Krush played f takes e5. But after bishop h6, and then bishop e3 check, and now rook d3, an excellent move, a decoy move, taking note of the weak back rank, black was in charge. Krush played rook d e1, and now Lanic continued tactical bombardment with rook f2. As I say, the exchanges favour black in this position with his queenside pawn majority. It's just a question of consolidating white's passed pawn on e5. King f8, very accurate, bringing the king to the centre, ready for the endgame, and keeping the king out of harm's way of the knight. White went rook e1. Now the harvest begins, after bishop takes d4. After e6, white's last trump, rook e3 was very good. And after rook d1, Lanic skillfully negotiated his way through to a good rook endgame after bishop takes d6, and now a very good move, rook a3. And now what is white to do? She was pinning her last hopes on, for instance, king e7, rook a6. But rook a3 completely snuffs that out. After king e7, rook e2, rook a6, rook takes a2, rook takes b4, king takes a6. The position is winning for black, who has an extra pawn and a more active king to boot. Rook b7 was played, h5, rook g7, king f5. Now the problem with white's king rears its ugly head. King f6, rook c7. The passed pawn begins its journey. There's a check. g5, rook c5, king f3, threatening mate. This is the problem. h3, white has two weaknesses. Not only is she worried about a king, she's worried about the a pawn. She can't defend both. g4, excellent. King f2, h takes g4. Even simplification can't help white here, as the pawn inexorably shepherds itself to victory. And after rook b4, white resigned. Essentially, this is 𝐵𝐫𝐿, nothing moves. If the rook moves, she loses her g-pawn. The king can't move. Well, it can go to h2, I suppose. And after that, black just plays rook e4. So, Krush resigned. Going back then to queen d2. It turns out that c takes d4, followed by knight c6, and bishop g4 is an effective and easy way to neutralise this variation. You can play this with confidence. A rare offshoot of the exchange variation begins after the following moves: d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, white takes, allows black to take on c3, and then plays his knight to f3. We know now to play c5, and then comes bishop b5 check. White aims for the simple life with this move. He wants to exchange perhaps a pair of minor pieces, and then gradually, as is typical of the exchange variation, hope to exploit his central pawn majority. Well, I think the straightforward way is best, and that black should play knight c6. Of course, there are other moves like bishop d7 and knight d7, but they generally interfere with black's most natural plan of deployment, which is to bring the knight to c6, and then the bishop on c8 out to g4 wherever possible. We're going now to consider the game Kramnik versus Svidler, played in the Melody Amber tournament in 2007, to illustrate how black should play this position. Well, Kramnik decided to castle. The first thing to note about this position is that d5 is not an especially good move. Of course, black responds with a6, and then, well, taking on c6 with the pawn doesn't really achieve anything. Black exchanges queens and then takes the bishop. So bishop a4 is generally regarded as the best move, and now black ploughs on with b5. Should white take on c6? Black takes on a4. Well, black has two nice bishops in this position, and obvious pressure against the pawn at c3. In my view, this position is unpromising for white. If he, for instance, takes on d8, we can take back with the king, and who is to say that the black pawns are weaker than white's pawns? That's simply not true. The pawn at c3 has to be defended, and black's plan of king c7 and then king takes c6 should leave him with a very easy game. Hence, castles is thought to be the best move, and then I think queen b6 is good. Queen takes a4 is more or less forced, and then we can take on c3. Well, white's rook on a1 is rather, how can I put it, hamstrung. So rook d1 is a good move here, and that threatens c7, discovered check. So black should castle. Bishop h6, all this is forced. Bishop takes a1, bishop takes f8, king takes f8, rook takes a1, and now the final component in our plan, bishop out to g4, a move which gives black instantly a very good game. For instance, if knight d2, we play queen b2, which is a very nasty fork. Meanwhile, if rook c1, just bishop takes f3, messing up the kingside pawns, and then rook c8 will do when black enters a favourable endgame. So with d5 not really looking that great, that's why Kramnik castled. Now black put a typical Grunfeld mechanism into action by taking on d4, weakening that pawn, castling. White brought his bishop out to g3, and black played bishop g4, when the pressure against d4 is reaching its height. Now, white's got to try and make sense of the position of the bishop on b5. I mean, otherwise it's completely ineffectual out there. Normally the bishop would be much better placed on e2 in this position. So in order to make sense of his move so far, Kramnik decided to take on c6 and play rook c1. And that's about the best white can hope for from this variation. A promise of pressure against the pawn at c6. Well, as is typical of the Grunfeld, active, fluid counterplay is the order of the day, and black moved his queen out to a5, creating counterbalancing pressure against a2. Alright, Kramnik is hoping for a better endgame here after queen takes d2, knight takes d2, but rook fd8 once again emphasised the point that white's pawn on d4 was at least as weak as the pawn on c6. After knight b3, black played a5, active counterplay, and after rook takes c6, a4. Turns out that white has been completely unable to muster anything concrete in this position, and despite f3, black had rook c8. This is a very accurate game by both players, really. Once white has sowed the seeds of the opening by playing bishop b5, you can scarcely do better than hoping to get some sort of minimal edge in an endgame like this, but black can stir up distinct trouble with the a-pawn. White goes knight b3, hitting the bishop, and now black brings his rook back to d8. And after rook c7, we have bishop e6. Now white played rook a7. Well, white has no time to, of course, take this pawn. After rook takes e7, we have bishop takes b3, and then simply a2, winning straight away. Because after rook a7, rook d1 check. So rook a7 was played in behind the passed pawn. There was a check. King f2, bishop takes b3, rook d2 check, and the two players agreed to a draw. If king e3, we have rook takes g2, with black for choice. If king g3, we have a2. And this position, I think, looks drawn. Maybe black is slightly for choice, but white will force black to play rook b2 in a minute by pushing his b pawn. Let's say white plays b4 straight away, and there will be an exchange of a for b pawn with a complete draw. So that's the state of play in the bishop b5 variation. Not an especially dangerous line for black to face, and with knight c6, black gets a very decent game. Well, we now come to an annoying set of variations. I'm not sure who they annoy more, mind you, black or white, where white tries to depart from the norm in the exchange Grunfeld and play all sorts of strange moves, hoping to lure black into misplacing his pieces. And the first of these I want to look at is bishop b5 check, which looks like a very weird move because it gives black a free tempo with c6, and after that white puts his bishop on the side with bishop a4. Yet this move has become popular with many grandmasters in recent years. simply because it adds an original touch to the exchange variation, I would say, and white still has options with his king's knight and with his f-pawn, which are two of the main trumps, let's face it, in the exchange variation. Moreover, black's been enticed to play c6 when we know really he wants to play c5, and so black's got to take a little bit of time to organise this freeing advance. Well, we now come to the game Drozdovsky versus Sutovsky, both grandmasters, and this game was played in the Moscow Aeroflot Open in 2007. If there is a drawback to white's idea, it must be that it is rather slow, and it's not at all clear whether the bishop on a4 is well placed or not. So Sutovsky got on with the job by castling and then bringing his queen out to a5, immediately attacking the pawn on c3, when Drozdovsky played bishop d2. Now comes a good move. Queen a6, keeping the white king in the centre. Now, in a position like this, black can also think about the move e5. I think a definite plan would be here to move the bishop out to g4, to play the knight to d7, and then to look for opportunities to play either e5 or c5. With both these ideas in mind, black should be able to retain a good game. But for the time being, white has got to worry about his king. He can't play queen e2 for the time being because the bishop on a4 will be hanging. So that's why bishop b3 is played. And now, Sutovsky plays c5 straight away, which returns to a more conventional type of position, but with perhaps the black queen on a slightly odd square, and the white bishop's not optimal at all on d2 and b3. With knight c6, c takes d4, bishop g4 coming up, black should be in good shape, which is why white committed himself in this position with d5, keeping the knight out of c6. And of course, black wants to take advantage of the position of the white king in the middle, so he opens up the e-file straight away with e6. Well, taking on e6 in this position leaves the white pawn structure looking rather ragged. I mean, black just recaptures, and now white's queenside pawns don't really impress. So Drozdovsky decided to go for the endgame with queen e2. I've got distinct pronunciation problems with this guy's name, but I hope you'll bear with me. Black took the queen on e2, took on d5. Well, white can take with the pawn, of course, but then he opens up his king, so he took with the bishop. And now black brings his knight to d7. Rook a b1 was played, hitting the b pawn, and black comfortably covered the weakness with knight b6, en passant, attacking the bishop. And white retreated with bishop b3. Well, this is the 5th time he's actually moved this bishop, and if we can't take advantage of this loss of time, then really we shouldn't really call ourselves a Grunfeld player. I think probably white has just got to accept that he's not better in this position and surrender the bishop pair after c4. But of course, after knight takes d5, black is in very good shape with a check and then simply b6, connecting the queenside pawns and getting ready to activate this bishop on c8 against perhaps the pawn on c4. You know, only black can be better in this position. Perhaps he would start with either bishop a6 or bishop f5 and then bishop e4. In either case, black is absolutely fine. But bishop b3, very slow, and black played rook e8 to attack the pawn on e4. Well, white couldn't really see any real way of protecting that pawn with ease. I mean, black is ready to attack this pawn again and again with moves. For instance, if he plays, well, it's difficult to see a move for white. For instance, if he plays king d3, we've immediately got c4 check, and then the white king is dragged out into the open board. This can't be good. So Drozdovsky played bishop e3, and black played bishop d7. Now white should certainly try bishop takes c5, rook takes e4 check, king d2. He could then hope to block out the black attack by stationing a piece on d4. Not nice for white, but, you know, some survival chances. Instead, he plays rook h c1, just protecting his pawn on c3. But really, this is a miserable location for the rook. And Sutovsky moved in with rook takes e4. Now, he'd obviously calculated some distance ahead when he played rook takes e4. Also good for black, of course, was just c4, attacking the bishop, and then bishop takes c3. This clearly was good for black. The rook takes e4 looks as though it might be a mistake for the time being, because white can play bishop takes f7 check. And now, of course, not king takes f7, where knight g5 check forks the king and the rook. But Ściutowski, as I say, had it all under control. He played king f8 in this position. It looks as though, at first sight, white should be able to take on c5, but let's not forget this bishop is pinned. So bishop b3 was played, bishop b5 check, and white went king d1. An understandable move, because he wants to unpin that bishop on e3. But nevertheless, king e1 was probably a slightly better move. Just allowing bishop h6, after which white has bishop c2. And that's a double attack against both e4 and b5. So I think what I'm saying is, after king e1, black's got to find a better move than bishop h6. White has some counterplay here. After king d1, which is obviously what both players have been counting on, we have rook d8 check, knight d2, and then the superb move, rook takes e3, eliminating a defender of d2. And after f takes e3, Ściutowski moved in for the kill with c4. Well, now if bishop c2, obviously bishop takes c3, rook takes b5, rook takes d2 check, king e1, rook takes c2 check, and white's position is falling apart. For instance, after king d1, we have another check on d2, a check on b2, and after rook takes b5, black emerges a piece ahead. So in the game, after c4, and just going back, white played a4, c takes b3, a takes b5, and then the very straightforward move knight c4, after which black is winning material. So with d2 falling, Ściutowski, and I'll get it right at the end of this game, decided to resign. So I think going back to the opening, the way Ściutowski played it is a very straightforward response to bishop b5 check. Just play c6, and then castle and play queen a5. If white wants to sacrifice a pawn with castles, by all means let him. Black's position is as solid as a rock. But if he plays bishop d2, then queen a6 looks good, with plans for bishop g4, e5 and c5 in mind. Very good play by black in this game. The second rather unusual move I want to consider in this section of the DVD for white is Keres' old move, bishop a3. Again, this is a move which is played very rarely at Grandmaster level. It has been seen recently a little bit, and mainly exists to surprise the black player. What black shouldn't do, of course, is to go passive against this variation. Somehow, he's got to blot that bishop a3 out of the game. The whole point of putting the bishop on a3, of course, is to restrain the move c5. White's idea is that if black doesn't get c5 in, his position's going to be a little bit passive. So if black doesn't react accurately against bishop a3, you can end up in a very restricted position with nothing to do, because, of course, e5 is also prevented after black castles. Well, it turns out the best recipe is to put the black knight on d7 in this position, and then to go through with c5 as quickly as possible. This is the book recommendation, and thoroughly respectable for black. And we now come to the short game, Nigalidze, graded 2466, versus Mchedlishvili, played in Tbilisi in June 2009, which demonstrates how black should play this position. The first point of playing this way for black is to enable the queen to come out. Queen a5, would be a very good deployment for the queen if black could actually play that move in peace. And for instance, if white makes a natural move here, we see black able to play queen a5 virtually immediately. For instance, bishop e2 looks natural, but I think after c takes d4, this is already quite awkward for white. He'd love to be able to take that with the pawn, but then queen a5 check would pick off the loose bishop on a3. So he has to take back with the knight, and after queen a5, bishop b4, queen e5, black is obviously in very good shape, getting ready to castle, and, well, you can see the white queenside pawns are on undesirable squares. Going back to c5, if bishop c4, a move that looks slightly too aggressive at this early stage, we have c takes d4, and again, white has to recapture with the knight, a most undesirable state of affairs. But after knight takes castles, castles, queen c7, typical Grunfeld stuff, hitting the bishop, queen b3, then black goes knight c5. The activity of the bishop on a3 is limited. Black's hitting the queen, and he's getting ready to complete development with moves like b6 and bishop b7. So white cannot, I think I'm saying, play this position naturally. He's got to continue with slightly unusual moves, and this is why 𝐦𝐨𝐿𝐵𝐿𝐵 played the best move here, which is queen b3. Well, black sticks with Grunfeld motifs. He castles, and then he plays his queen to c7. White castles, and now 𝐵𝐶𝐿𝐵𝐿𝐵, who's graded 2586, played rook b8. Somewhere along the line, he may even be thinking about getting b5 in, which would slightly exploit the position of white's queenside pieces. So 𝐦𝐨𝐿𝐵𝐿𝐵 tried to move in and muscle black out of the game with e5, immediately threatening e6, which black would pay to by playing e6 himself. Then came knight d2, a good move. I think this again represents state of the art, this game, in this variation. Now black's got to be slightly concerned about knight e4, which both threatens knight d6 and pressurises c5. So this is an effective way for white to counter black's idea of b5. Hence black played b6 and played his bishop to b7. The knight came into d6. Black played bishop d5, provoking white's pawns forward, then dropped his bishop back to c6. And in this position, the two players agreed a draw. Now, you or I might not agree a draw in this position, but the fact is, white's got slight problems holding his centre together. So probably the most sensible way for white is to play knight b5, and after queen b7, bring his knight back to d6. And I think this is the reason why both players agreed to a draw. If we go back to the final position as played in the game, we quickly see that, you know, black is threatening to take on d4, which in turn would weaken the pawn on e5. So white's got to do something very quickly. He can't just do nothing in this position. Hence the drawing mechanism. And so if a draw is the best white's got from this variation, then really it's hardly possible to recommend it. Bishop a3 will still have some supporters on the grandmaster scene, in fact at all levels. But I think with knight d7 and c5, black adequately counters this idea. Another little surprise white players might try to spring on black in the exchange variation is the move queen a4 check. Another one of those peculiar moves which when you first see it makes you sort of sit up and think, well, what on earth is he intending to do? Well, the simple fact is white is trying to entice black into misplacing his pieces. It's not so easy, funnily enough, after this queen check, for black to arrange his pieces in the most convenient fashion. For instance, black certainly doesn't want to play queen d7 in this particular position. Bishop d7, well, the development of this bishop on c8, it's interesting. You know, I think the best square for this bishop in the exchange Grunfeld is probably b7, but you can't often get it there. Much more frequently, you see the bishop coming out to g4. But of course, when the bishop, when the knight on g1 is still at home, there's really no good square for the bishop. So probably, if black played bishop d7 in this position, white would simply drop his queen back to either b3 or maybe even a3. That's another interesting location for the queen in this variation, intending to perhaps tie black down to the defence of e7. And the bishop is slightly misplaced on d7 already, and especially with rook b1 coming up as well. So I think, all in all, as black wants to play c5 in one go, probably knight d7 is the most efficient move here. And just accept, you know, that for the time being you can't get your bishop out of g4 when he plays knight f3. Okay, well, but after castles, again, black is threatening c5 and should have a satisfactory game. Which brings us to an encounter from the Edmonton Open in 2008 between Alexander Moisenko, graded 2632, and the Indian Grandmaster Surya Shekhar Ganguly. And in this particular game, white played bishop g5. Now, there are obviously alternatives for white, but in general, the plan for black is the same. c5, queen c7, b6, and then bishop b7. If white makes neutral moves, black will get a pretty decent game by putting into practice this normal plan. So white tries to tie black down to e7, quite a common theme in this line, by playing bishop g5. Black plays c5 straight away. Now comes rook b1, knight b6. I think making use of the knight on d7 is a good idea here. The knight comes around to attack the queen, and Moisenko drops his queen back to a3. So I think this transfer of the queen to a3 is thematic in this line, and now black has to start thinking about e7, how he's going to resolve the position of this pawn. Note that white's attacking c5, so probably Ganguly's next move is forced. He played h6 to nudge the bishop away from the hit on e7. Now in the game, Moisenko went bishop e3, which is very consistent with the aims and aspirations of this line. White's gradually reaching a normal position, but with the black pieces on slightly odd squares. The pawn up on h6, the knight on b6. Do these moves really fit into any coherent plan? Probably bishop h4 could also have been played, but I have the feeling in this position that black might be able to get away with g5 and then the capture on on d4, and then something like bishop g4. White has taken a lot of time here, playing queen a3, playing his rook to b1, playing his bishop round to g3. Meanwhile, black's playing normal moves, and there's every chance black could catch the white king in the centre or win a pawn. So that's why white drops his bishop back to e3. Now black takes on d4, and with the white king still in the centre, energy is the order of the day. You've got to get used to these energetic moves in the Grunfeld, and Ganguly hit out with f5. Normally speaking, that would be a rather weakening move, but as white's development is lagging and his king is still in the centre, black figures he should open up the game straight away to take advantage of this temporary feature of the position. I mean, if white is allowed to just complete his development in peace, let's say with bishop e2 and castles, then it'll probably be slightly better, because the knight on b6 is misplaced, and black isn't really challenging the white central pawns. But f5 mounts a direct challenge to those pawns, and white played bishop d3. Of course, if he plays e5 in this position, well, black has definite choices. I mean, you can think about playing even f4, and then the bishop coming out to f5. It all starts to look very active. Black can also consider a move like bishop e6. He can further consider bishop e6 straight away. And this looks pretty decent for black. There's even a possibility of g5 with kingside pawn storm in the offing. So white thinks to himself, I've got to get my pieces out, and plays bishop d3. But black continues with commendable energy, taking on e4 and then playing bishop f5, once again putting the question to the bishop. Well, white scarcely has any better move than to take on f5. This brings the rook into active play. Both sides' pawn structure are a little bit fragmented. You've got the pawn on e7 there vis-a-vis the pawn on d4. But black has plenty of active play and should be absolutely okay here. Note the knight on b6 has suddenly got a couple of nice squares in the centre of the board to think about occupying. So Ganguly plays his queen up to d6. He wants to neutralise the power of white's queen. And white seems quite happy to oblige and then to push on his pawn to d5. This is the rationality of the Grandmaster. He's trading off one weak pawn for another. He's essentially jettisoning his weaknesses in order to bring the rook on b1 into the game. Well, naturally, after a move like this, things tend to fizzle out a bit. Black took the pawn on d5. White recaptured on b6. There was a capture on a2. White took on b7. You can see how, in this totally simplified situation, the game could burn out to a draw. Well, if white could find time to double his rooks on the 7th rank, you know, he might be in decent shape. But even then, I mean, he's not really threatening anything if black moves his bishop. Meanwhile, white's got a little bit of tidying up to do on his own back rank before he can ever get this mechanism going. So black, for his part, just brings his pieces into safe locations and then neutralises white's rook on the 7th rank. It's logical play. White keeps his rook active. Black just brings his rook across in behind the passed pawn. White's got nothing better than to trade, and then we just reach a natural balance. The knight comes in, forking rook and pawn. Rook comes across. Knight goes to c4. Rook comes across again. Knight goes to e3. Obviously, taking this pawn is completely out of the question due to rook d7. So white goes knight e3, black goes king f7, and the two players agreed to a draw. So I think what I'm saying, if we go back to the opening, is that queen a4 isn't especially dangerous. It should be met by knight d7, and then black's looking to play normal Grunfeld moves such as c5 castles, queen c7, etc. Any white player worth his salt is going to try and intercept this plan. We saw 𝐵𝐸𝐶 trying to nail black to e7, but not really getting too much of a grip on the game in the opening stage in order to be able to do so. Generally, white's plan's a little bit slow, and black should be able to comfortably meet it. You may have thought we'd reached the end of our investigations into the exchange variation, but no, there are yet more systems to examine. And one of these is a move which outwardly looks very modest, bishop d2, but which has actually been played quite frequently in grandmaster practice in recent years. It's an old idea of Vasily Smyslov, and the point is to prepare the move e4, and should black take on c3 in this position, which he generally doesn't do, white can recapture with the bishop. Later on, white plays d5 and tries to exchange off black's valuable fianchetto bishop. As Grunfeld players, we're not really interested in that, so knight b6 has become recognised as the best move. It's not often you see the black knight dropping back to b6 in the exchange Grunfeld, but here is a special case, because black's already hitting d4, and white's got to go to tempo losing legs in order to protect that pawn coherently, and he does so generally by playing bishop e3. So at the cost of one move, white has forced the black knight back to b6. Is it worth it? That is the argument underpinning this variation. Now we come to the game Jean-Hubert, Canadian international master, playing Peter Svidler, and this game was played in the FIDE World Cup in November 2009 in 𝐾𝐫𝐬𝐬𝐻. And if Svidler is willing to drop his knight back to b6, then he generally feels, I think, that black can get a reasonable position in this line, and I agree. Now this position is the parting of the ways, as white has several moves which he's tried. In the game, Hubert plays the very peculiar move, bishop b5, another obscure idea intending to lure the black pieces onto strange squares. There are other, more natural moves, and I'm going to consider them now. In the first variation, white plays bishop e2, contenting himself with simple development. I think going back, if white had played knight f3, then black will be only too happy to bombard the centre, starting with moves like bishop g4. So white tries to delay knight f3 until the right moment. In the bishop e2 line, black should play knight c6. If white pushes on in the centre, then I think the black knight could easily come out to a5 with the intention of repositioning itself on c4 as quickly as possible. Knight e5 is also a possibility. So white generally plays knight f3 to stop it, and after bishop g4 we get the main line with d5. Black takes on f3 and plays knight to e5, and white generally plays queen b3 in order to stop the black knight from reaching c4. Well, in a position like this, with the white pawns ready to roll, this type of position is borrowed from the Smyslov system in the 5 queen b3 variation, which we'll be considering on DVD 2. Black's got to chip away at white's centre quickly in order to anticipate f4. In fact, this position with the black knight dropping back has been seen a number of times in grandmaster practice, and it looks good for white, 2 bishops in the centre, but white's got a problem finding a safe haven for his king, and he's got the immediate difficulty of dealing with black's threat of taking on d5, which would mess up the structure. So white generally takes on c6, castles on the queen side, black plays e6, and now, however white plays this position, it doesn't seem as though he gets any advantage. In fact, I slightly prefer black's game. Let's see what white can do. For instance, the first move he can try is queen a3. Well, then I think queen h4. And it's not clear to me that the pawn on c6 is any weaker than the pawn on f4. Black's perhaps thinking about bishop h6, hitting that pawn immediately. Going back to e6, white can try rook d6, then comes queen c7, again with a comfortable game for black. And if queen c2 in this position, as played in the game 𝐆𝐫𝐿𝐿, Southend, white goes queen c2, queen e7, h4. Then we have rook fb8, and black gains counterplay via the move a5. This would be a typical way that black tries to open white up in this system. And whether white opens the h file or not, it's really not exactly easy to carry this white attack further. Meanwhile, for black, it's simpler. He pushes his a pawn until it hurts. In the game 𝐆𝐫𝐿𝐷𝐿, after bishop d4, black played e5, f takes e5, and now c5, with an excellent game. For instance, if bishop e3, well, we have knight takes e5. There may even be the a3 prod first. So, going back to castles, bishop e2 should allow black a decent position with normal Grunfeld moves. So white has also tried h3 here, hoping to have his cake and eat it in many ways. He wants to play knight f3, bishop e2 in peace without being hassled by bishop g4. Well, as soon as you see a move like that appearing on the board, black should think about active play, because white's plan is very slow. Thus, this is the right moment for f5. And I think after e takes f5, bishop takes f5, black has a very active position, bringing out his pieces. If queen b3 check, he parks the king in the corner. And once again, black has pretty serious counterplay here, with ideas, for instance, of a5 and then knight b4. That would be a normal plan. White plays bishop e2, let's say, a5, castles, a4, queen a3, queen d6. Well, this position is completely equal. And if after king h8, white castles on the queen side, we go a5 again, with pretty good play. So I think the h3 variation is slow. Now white has also tried f4. This was a favourite of Romanian Grandmaster Florin Georgiu a long time ago, 20, 30 years ago. And his idea was after knight c6 he was going d5. Well, then I think knight a5 is a decent move. And if white goes knight f3, we go bishop g4. If h3 here, we can go knight a c4. With equality, after both bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, which I actually quite like for black, or bishop takes b6, forcing bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, knight takes b6, and then black gets his counterplay together on the queen side by pushing his a pawn up and then moving his queen to d6, with the plan queen c5 and then c6. Which brings us finally, once again, back to our game 𝐵𝐵𝐿 versus Svidler and the peculiar move bishop b5. Evidently, 𝐵𝐵𝐿 was trying to surprise Svidler on that day, but it all looks rather slow. Black played a6 and then hit out with f5. Alright, he takes f5. Really, white would like to maintain his centre, but he comes up against the problem of his king stuck in the middle time and time again. You can't just endlessly play slow moves in the exchange Grunfeld. Black is far too active, and well, I think in the position after f5, black is already threatening moves like f4, which would win the d4 pawn. So white's got to take, and black now brings his bishop out to f5. Queen b3 check, king h8, knight f3. We've seen this before. And now queen d6, whereby actually Svidler's managed to make use of the move a6 in this position, because white doesn't have knight b5. So I think after h3 and now knight c6, black has completed the opening skirmishes in peace and with a reasonable position. All his pieces are in active play, and he's again threatening moves like knight b4, which 𝐵𝐵𝐿 rather peculiarly provokes by playing d5. Perhaps he thought after knight d4 he was actually getting away with it. But again, I don't like the position of the white king in this line. He's got to more or less take on f5 and go long. And after queen e5, which I think 𝐵𝐵𝐿 probably missed, black has a very good game. Well, what is white to do in this position? Black is exerting pressure all over the position, and, well, white's a pawn down. Black is threatening knight takes c3, and knight takes e3. After long thought, 𝐵𝐵𝐿 could find nothing better than bishop f3, and now Svidler won a second pawn by just taking on e3 twice. This is a very bad day at the office for 𝐵𝐵𝐿, but it does give you a good indication of how quick black's chances can appear in this line if white plays very slowly. Now after queen c5, knight c4 is the primary threat, followed by knight e3. White played rook he1, black doubled on the f-file, queen e6, and now the safety move bishop f6. White's 2 pawns down. You know, black doesn't need to rush or hurry. He just can move his pieces to good locations. And now after rook c5, the knight on c3 is attacked. Rook d3 was played, knight c4, and black won this position. White resigned. Pressure is mounting against the queen side, against b2. c3 as well is under fire. 𝐵𝐵, 2 pawns down, has had quite enough. So I think we can safely conclude that bishop b5 is rather an artificial idea in this position. Well, summarising bishop d2, I don't think you have to face this variation very often, but my impression of it is that it's rather slow. I think a lot of players at grandmaster level are employing this move simply for novelty value. They can't find anything in the main lines of the 𝐶𝐽-Grunfeld, so they're seeking to do something different and maybe surprise their opponent. Objectively, though, black is absolutely fine. A very, very peculiar move, which is, again, taken centre stage for a little while in grandmaster play recently, is the move knight a4. I can't believe that this move will have anything other than a temporary appearance on the grandmaster stage. It's a peculiar idea, but it must be said that white is playing with the intention of going e4 as quickly as he can, and if black drops the knight back to b6, then white can often slide his knight into c5, which has a slightly inhibiting effect on black's game. However, it is a rather serious violation of opening principles, and an energetic response, I would say, is in order against play of this type. Therefore, I think e5 is a good move. A very surprising and unstereotyped response, but, you know, white's move is also very unusual. Quite often in chess, an unorthodox reply to an unorthodox move is often the correct one. So we come now to the game 𝐵𝐵𝐼𝐻 versus 𝐶𝐽, which was played in Montecatini in 2000. And there, white took the pawn, and black played knight c6. 𝐵𝐵𝐼𝐻 versus 𝐶𝐽, 2 very strong grandmasters. I think what we see in this game is 𝐶𝐽 trying to meet this artificial play by white with sheer energy. Now, after knight f3, black has 2 ways to get a good game. I mean, you can play bishop b4 check straight away, and after bishop d2, go bishop g4. There's no real way for white to keep his pawn. Meanwhile, after bishop takes b4, knight d takes b4, black is getting all his pieces out very quickly. But in this game, black went knight d b4. An interesting idea from 𝐶𝐽, allowing the exchange of queens, which white declined with bishop g5. Now, if I may, I just want to drop back a couple of moves to the position where white played knight f3. Now, white can waste even more time in this position by playing a3. And the clear point of this is to keep a black piece out of b4. I suppose if white plays knight a4, you can certainly consider playing a move like a3. However, I think once again, by sticking to the basics, by concentrating on development, black gets a very good game. And I recommend bishop f5 here, as played in the game Kantler versus 𝐆𝐫𝐼𝐻, Israel, 1999. Black stopping e4, and after knight f3, he's just going to get his pieces out, as 𝐆𝐫𝐼𝐻 did by playing his queen up to d7 and then casting on the queen side. After bishop e2, queen e7, queen b3, bishop g7, it can quickly be seen that black is going to regain his pawn with excellent development. For instance, after castles, black just took on e5 and is in very good shape. So knight a4 and a3, well, you know, let's not go over the top against these moves. Let's just concentrate on the basics, getting our pieces out, and we're going to be okay. So knight f3 was played in 𝐵𝐵𝐼𝐻 and 𝐶𝐽. Knight d b4, and then bishop g5. 𝐶𝐽 took on d1. King takes d1. Well, regrettably, I don't think rook takes d1 is a particularly good idea. Black could already consider moves like knight c2 check, bishop f5 is also good after that. Let's just see it. So king takes d1 was played. Cherov played bishop e6. White brought his knight back to c3, more to protect the pawn on a3 than anything else. And black played bishop g7. So black is now hitting the pawn on e5. If white elects to waste more time with bishop f6, black gets a very serious initiative here by taking on f6, castling, and then bringing his rook to the centre. I like this for black. Going back to the position after bishop g7 in the game, white played a3. Cherov played knight d5, confident in his superior development to see him through. And then after knight takes e5, black recaptured the pawn with excellent development, a safer king, and it's only white who has to fight hard for an equal position here. You know, white's got fractured queenside pawns, his king's in the centre. It's evident that black has succeeded in winning the battle of the opening. Well, Leputchin's a very strong grandmaster. He knows he can't do anything in this position. He's just got to accept that he's got slightly the worst of things here. He's not resignable by any means, and just hunker down and try and avoid making further weaknesses. This is the way strong players play these positions. They don't go mad. They just play rationally, and they try to avoid making their position worse. White's task is simply to neutralise here, not to try to attack or to get the advantage or the initiative. So Leputchin just centralises his pieces, plays very sanely, offers further exchanges, and invites black to try and win this position. Now, even here in the game, black is still a lot better. He's better because his bishop is superior to white's. White's got more pawns locked on the same colour square as his bishop. That's the way to judge these positions. So if I was Cherov, I would definitely give close consideration to a move like h5 here, intending to manoeuvre the bishop to e7, to put distinct pressure on the white pawn structure. In the game, black decided to play king e6. I mean, that's tempting to bring the king up to f5, but it does allow white to play h5, trying to jettison his weakness. Now, of course, black could consider taking the pawn on h5, but that would give white a target after a move like rook h1. So Cherov keeps his structure intact and decides to play g5. Again, I feel slightly uneasy about this move because it gives white the chance to dissolve his weaknesses. Probably bishop f8 was a better move here, just getting the bishop active and maintaining various ideas in the position. After g5, rook g1, white gets a chance to initiate a tactical idea. His idea is that after g takes f4, he's going bishop takes f4, and the rook ending is not so clear. Cherov played bishop takes e5. If black goes bishop f8 in this position, white has bishop h2 with active play along the g file. So after bishop takes f4, bishop takes e5, white was able to play bishop h6. And now I think white is in the game with his passed h-pawn. It's not so easy for black to realise his advantage, particularly when Leputchin played rook a d1. Good move. Exchanging off a pair of rooks helps in this position, because after rook h8, bishop e3, rook takes h5, white has rook d7. You can see what I mean by rational play. White sacks a pawn temporarily to get his pieces active. So after bishop e5, rook takes f7, it looks as though it's burning out. And that's exactly what happened. White hasn't got the firepower really black hasn't got the firepower, to make anything of his small advantage. And the game starts to fizzle out. Black solidifies his pawns on the queen side. White centralises his pieces. Bishop f4, rook takes f3, rook d4 check. Off come the pawns, and in we go to a drawn rook and pawn ending, where black can't really win because white has no passed pawn. White just maintains the defence of the fourth rank, moving his rook to and fro, rook g4, rook h4, and neither side can make progress. So if we just go back to the opening and the move knight a4, how can we summarise this move? If white is allowed the time he needs to get his position going, for instance, to play e4 in peace and then to play knight c5 or something like that, maybe knight f3 first, he could get a grip on the game. Black must respond energetically, and with e5 and then knight c6, I think he finds the correct way to tackle this tricky variation. Try to remember the themes and ideas in this game. Black playing actively, not allowing white time to play his ideas. You'll be playing in the true Grunfeld style, and you'll get a good game against knight a4. We come now to the fianchetto variation of the Grunfeld. Not exactly a regular visitor at club level, but a variation which has to be fully respected and studied. As against the King's Indian, White's initial ambitions are modest. He contents himself with a two-pawn centre and a very safe king. Later on, he hopes to use his slight advantage in space to convert a small edge into something larger as the middle game progresses. We should be respectful and hit out with d5 at the right moment on move 5. Now White has two choices. He can elect to let Black take on c4, or, in the first variation we're going to examine, take on d5 and hope to make the Black knight on d5 a target. Well, in this variation, White castles, and now I'm recommending a rather unusual move in this position, but one which I think will certainly set your opponent's thinking: pawn up to c5. In many ways, this is a very thematic Grunfeld counter, and the idea is simply to get rid of that pawn on d4 as quickly as possible in order to open up the diagonal for the bishop on g7. The question is, what happens if White takes this pawn? Now, if White, of course, doesn't take the pawn, then I think Black can fully justify his opening selection by simply bombarding d4 until it falls, or White has to relinquish that point. So taking is the most important move, and now Black plays knight a6. And I should stress at this point that if once again Black is allowed to recapture this pawn without any tears, he ends up with a very good game, because already White's queenside is feeling a little bit under pressure. He can't move the bishop on c1 because b2 hangs, and the knight on c3 is not easy to develop to a good square either. Which brings us to our first game, Vasily Papin, graded 2529, versus Igor Kurnusov, 2669, and this game was played in the Russian Higher League Championship in September 2009. And White played the approved move here, knight g5, not allowing Black time to settle in view of the attack on d5. Well, Black is very keen to keep his knight entrenched in the centre and plays e6. And now White plays knight e4, keeping his pawn for the time being. Black should now transfer the bishop to c6 as quickly as possible, and not worry himself too much about regaining the pawn immediately. He can easily regain it at his leisure, and his idea now is to play rook c8 and just take the pawn. So White plays knight bc3, reinforcing the pressure on d5, and Black plays bishop c6. So a small game for White there, in that he's taken away Black's idea of rook c8. Well, Papin could find nothing better than bishop d2, and now Black played f5. The idea of f5 is very simple. Knight a6 takes c5 will be the next move when the knight on e4 moves. So, seeing this natural continuation coming up, White sought refuge in exchanges on d5, and then he played knight c3. But after the capture on g2, and then the recapture on c5, Black already had a good position. White's king position is slightly worse than Black, and Black's central pawn formation, whilst advanced, harmoniously complements his bishop on g7. Bishop e3, attacking the knight, queen e7, and rook c1 was answered by rook c8. So by very natural means, Black has emerged from the opening with a good position. White played rook c2, and Black reinforced the knight by playing b6, whereupon White played queen c1. Well, of course, this position is nothing special for White, although Black has to prove that he has something here. He kicked off with queen b7, check, White played f3, and just in case there were any tactics on the c-file, Black decided to forestall those by playing knight d7. The knight reroutes to f6, And again, I should stress black has a very comfortable position here. White played rook d1, natural enough. Black played knight f6, and it seems like both players are playing out a reasonably level position after bishop d4. But I would argue that after rook fd8, black has slightly the more harmonious position due to his better placed queen, and as I say, the slightly more advanced central pawns, which cover important squares in the middle of the board. Queen e3 was played, and black used his king actively with king f7. This is a grandmasterly move in my estimation. You know, it's not the type of move an average club player might make, but it's a move which shows excellent judgment. Black is saying to himself, well, I don't see any way that white can intensify the pressure against my king, and given that my pawn on e6 is attacked, I'm just going to defend it. My queen's good on b7, my rooks are nice, I don't want to waste any firepower defending the pawn on e6 with one of those pieces, so I'm going to defend economically with my king and await events. And after h3, black played his knight to d5. A very useful move indeed, taking advantage of the fact that the knight on c3 is pinned against the rook on c2. So black still has perhaps slightly the better game. Queen g1 was good in the sense that it removes the queen from attack, but it does nothing to halt black's initiative, and Kornusov powers forward with f4. King h1 was played. White is running scared, and black pushes forward once again with e5. It's that pin on the knight at c3 that's really tying white up here. After bishop f2, black powered forward once again with e4. And now white starts to really get into trouble. His king is coming under fire. There are threats of taking on f3. If white takes on e4 in this position, then I think black takes on c3, followed by a very powerful recapture indeed on e4. So Papan, probably slightly surprised at what had happened to him in this game, took on f4. Black executed his threat of taking on f3. Then he took on c3 with the bishop, another very unstereotyped move. B takes c3, and now knight takes f4. Completed a very well played game. The problem is that white's queen is overloaded. She needs, in this position, to be able to defend g4. But she can't play queen g4, simply because the rook on d1 hangs. Meanwhile, going back to knight takes f4, if rook takes d8, trying to negotiate that problem, black interposes queen takes f3, check, and again after king h2, well, queen takes h3 is checkmate. So that game gives you a good indication of the promise, going back to the opening, of the move c5. I remember facing this move in a game from an English Open tournament against international master Andrew Ledger, and being completely surprised that black was able to get away with this early show of aggression. By far the more normal continuation here is just retreating from the centre with knight b6 or knight c6. I think players of the fianchetto variation will be expecting these lines. Perhaps they won't be expecting c5. So not only will he be able to spring a surprise, he'll be playing a good move as well. I think what I'm looking for when I choose these lines, and bearing in mind the needs of the average club player, is a degree of simplicity and variations and lines which are easy to understand and implement. Thus the move c5 is thematic. It's not an especially deep move. The idea is simply to wrest control of the centre from white and open the diagonal for the bishop on g7. There could be nothing more thematic and Grunfeld-like in its execution. We've seen what happens when white takes on c5. Now let's take a look at the aggressive move e4, which was played in the game 𝐵𝐵𝐼𝐻 versus Nepomniachtchi, graded 2632. And this game was played in Russia in September 2009. Black answered this early show of aggression with knight f6, giving immediate counterplay against e4, and white pressed forward with e5. Now black played knight fd7, and we can already see that white's centre is under pressure. So white has got to try and justify this early aggression by continuing in the same vein. And 𝐵𝐵𝐼𝐻 continued with knight g5, the idea of which is that after c takes d4, he ploughs through with e6. So it's very easy to imagine the average club player becoming quite scared about this play by white if he or she didn't know what they were doing. Fortunately, 𝐵𝐵𝐺𝐺 is about to give us a lesson in how to defend or even counter-attack in these positions. And he plays, first of all, his knight up to e5. I suppose if white takes on f7 in this position, black would normally play a move like king h8, but here there's no real need to do so, and he can answer e takes f7 check with simply knight takes f7. I think this is satisfactory, and well, again, black should be in good shape here. So in the game, white played f4, attacking the knight, which is understandable, and black countered with f6. Always on the lookout for aggression in the Grunfeld should be the mantra. White takes on e5, black takes on g5. There's an exchange on f8, and 𝐵𝐵𝐺𝐺 plays knight d2. Now black is able to catch up in development with knight c6, and then bishop takes e6. And after knight takes g5, white is hoping to land some sort of cheapo involved with queen b3 check if the black bishop retreats. Accordingly, black played queen c8, and now, well, black's threatening bishop takes e5, so white decided to play bishop f4. But after h6, the pace was being forced. White took the bishop, took the knight, and then took on g4. But black was right on time with g5. If it weren't for g5 in this position, I could imagine, for instance, if white had time for h4, that white might have a slight edge. He's got more active pieces, and he could train his sights on black's queenside pawns. But g5 turns the tables. The bishop must retreat, and black snaps off the pawn at e5. Moreover, he can answer the dangerous looking queen e4 with queen d5, and then queen g6 check with bishop g7. So as a result of the complications, white finds himself a pawn down, with not an enormous amount of compensation for it. After rook c1, which was the best 𝐵𝐵𝐺𝐺 could see, black started snatching pawns. Not to be intimidated by bishop d4, because he's got queen f7. Now lots of pieces came off, and basically white just admitted that he had to go into a rook ending, a pawn down. This might be okay for him if he didn't get his king cut off. And black instructively cuts off the king here by taking on b3. Then comes g4, and rook b2 was played. Well, white played rook f5 check. Black played king e6. And now it's a question of whether black can win this by mobilising the e-pawn. White went rook a5, king f7, rook f5 check, king e8, rook a5, and now rook d2 was played. In these positions, the most important thing is not to rush. Black's got all the time in the world to try to neutralise white's temporary initiative and to gradually exploit the advantage of the extra pawn. White's king emerges. Black plays rook d4, white plays h3, rook d2 check, king g3. The king is driven back, and now black plays king e6. Completely unhurried play by 𝐵𝐵𝐺𝐺. Well, he's got all the time in the world, but eventually it's going to come to whether he can get that e-pawn rolling. So rook a5, rook c6. Don't rush in these positions. Where's the fire? And now white loses patience and breaks free with h4. This is a typical reaction in positions where you're being tortured. You can't stand the tension any longer. In the end, though, I think black would be able to get that e-pawn rolling. But as I say, for instance, he could start with rook d6, rook d5, and gradually come forward. So white breaks with h4, hoping to exchange some pawns. Well, there's an exchange of pawns all right, and rook h5 was white's point, but after h3, rook takes h6 check, king e5, slowly the e-pawn is getting rolling, and once that pawn starts going, white is in trouble. Well, 𝐵𝐵𝐺𝐺 jettisoned the e-pawn in order to play rook c1. Rook h6 was played, rook c2 check, king f1, and now king g3. This might look as though it's some sort of easy position for white, but I assure you it's not. Note that black didn't waste any time taking off white's pawn. He uses the white pawn as a shield for his king to enter into the position. And only later will he take the pawn. After rook g4, white resigned. The threat basically is h2. If white goes king f1, black plays h2, and white finds himself in Zugzwang. If he moves his king, we play king g2. If he moves his rook, we play rook takes g6. There are simply no moves in this position. Well, I guess the threat, once again, is rook f4. And so, white decided to resign. Going back to the opening, e4 is aggressive, but I think black can negotiate the complications after e5, knight fd7, and simply c takes d4. If you're not sure about it, play over this game again. You will see that all the way through, black had things under control. The second Grunfeld-Fianchetto variation I'm going to examine is the line where white lets black take on c4 and answers that move with knight a3. This is a very common idea, and white's basic plan in this system is to control e5. He's hoping to just take that pawn back and then perhaps play a move like knight c or knight f to e5, opening up the bishop against the queen side. Black can fight against this with a thematic c3. And after b takes c3, c5, black has achieved two things. He's getting his normal active play together, hitting d4, opening up perspectives for the bishop on g7. He's also closed the c file, which is very important. It prevents white from penetrating into black's camp using that avenue. So white generally plays knight e5, and after knight d5, battle is joined. Once again, black wastes no time getting that bishop on g7 going. We now turn our attention to the game 𝐅𝐢𝐼𝐾 versus 𝐾𝐫𝐻, which was played in the Belarusian Championship in 1986. An old game, but thematic and well worth studying. White played queen b3, and black hit out with the unusual tactic, knight takes c3. After queen takes c3, black plays c takes d4. And now white has only one move, both to protect the knight on e5 and save his queen, and that's queen c5. But black now played knight a6, and after queen b5, he played knight c7. The white queen is being hounded here, and she's chained to the knight on e5. After queen a5, b6 reached a very interesting and thematic position. Now we get some interesting analysis. White has choices. In the game, white became confused by the complications, and after queen d2, black took on e5, white took on a8, surrendering his valuable Fianchetto bishop, and after knight takes a8, black was simply better. He's got an extremely powerful light square bishop and a couple of pawns for the exchange. Meanwhile, the white king side looks very weak. Going back to the position after b6, could white have done better? Well, if he played knight c6 here, we go b takes a5, knight takes d8, rook takes d8, bishop takes a8, knight takes a8, rook b1, bishop a6 getting active, rook e1, and now knight b6, with a very strong initiative. The c3 square beckons the knight, for instance after knight d5, and then knight c3. Black has two pawns for the exchange, ample compensation. Going back to the position after b6, queen a4 was suggested in some circles, and after bishop takes e5, we get an exchange on a8, and now again we reach the passing of the ways. Should white play queen takes a7 in this position, black unleashes the bishop on e5 by playing d3, and if rook b1, we go d takes e2, rook e1, and now queen d5, with a simple idea bishop b7, and then mate on g2. Going back to the position after d3, white may try to negotiate the position via a tactical route after bishop h6. Then comes d takes e2, bishop takes f8, bishop takes a1, rook e1, bishop c3, rook takes e2, and now queen d1 check. When after king g2, queen takes e2, queen takes a8, we have the excellent move bishop d4. The point of which is that after queen takes bishop, we have queen takes f2 check, king h3, and now the winner, queen f1 check. Let's see this. King h4, bishop f6, king g4, and now the splendid h5 checkmate. So you could see white was being a little bit bamboozled by these complications. Perhaps best was going back, queen a4, bishop takes e5, bishop takes a8, knight takes a8, and now bishop b2. But even there, black has very good compensation after bishop d7, queen b3, and now the simple knight c7, returning from the corner, and white will have some problems on the light squares in this position, to be sure. So perhaps 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼 task wasn't that easy after all, but certainly after queen d2, bishop takes e5, bishop takes rook, knight takes bishop b2, and now queen d5, black had a tremendous initiative. Well, rook fd1 was played. White's hoping to block with f3. So black doesn't waste any time with bishop b7, he just reinforces the pawn with rook d8. And after knight c2, black played bishop b7. It may well be that actually in this position knight c7 was a little bit better. Nevertheless, black played bishop b7, f3 was played, knight c7, and now white played queen b4. He could have tried taking on e4, but knight e6 was the black point, pinning the knight to the queen. If knight takes e6, we have queen takes d2, bishop takes e5, and now the cute rook takes e2. Well, in order to survive, white's got to go knight d8, but then comes bishop takes f3, bishop b8, rook g2 check, king f1, rook takes h2, and white is losing all his pawns here. If he goes rook e1, we just change the rooks, go a6, b5, and then bring the bishop back to d5. Black's got 4 pawns for the piece in this position, and the white knight is dominated. Complicated but very interesting stuff. So going back to the game, white played queen b4, black played bishop d6, queen b3, and now cemented his position with e5. After bishop a3, black played bishop c5, and after bishop takes c5, black played queen takes c5. So just taking stock, we can see that black still has a bishop and 2 pawns for the exchange, and white's position is very passive. The problem is white has no counterplay. In positions like this, you need an object of an attack. You need to tie the enemy down to stop them realising their obvious advantage. White has no object of attack, and thus black really has the complete run of the game. White's grovelling here, trying to defend. Black unhurriedly moves his pieces to good positions, and then breaks with e4. This is the winning move, opening up perspectives for the bishop against the white king. And, you know, once white has e4 to contend with, really, he's toast. I mean, he can't take on d4 here because of the fork. And if he plays rook a3, as per the game, black completes the undermining of the entire white pawn structure with d3. Well, in time trouble, white played e3. He could have taken on d3, and after e takes f3, he can maybe try rook e1. But then comes the splendid move here, f2 check. And if king takes f2, we have queen f6 check. And if king e2, all of black's pieces flood in with queen f3, rook takes d3, queen takes d3, king c1, and now a super move to finish, queen takes f1, winning on the spot. At the end, white emerges lots of material down. But the game wasn't much better. As I say, white was in time trouble, trying to cope with these complications. e3, e takes f3, white played h4, panic stations, queen e6. Now, the infiltration of the queen can only be stopped by king h2, but it's temporary. Bishop c8 was a cute retreat to finish things off. So 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼 resigned. I think what I'm saying is that when white allows black to take on c4, black should be in very good shape here after c3, and then c5. Time to pass on to another game in this system. What better way to conclude our investigation of the fianchetto variation by looking at the game by the legendary Garry Kasparov. This time against Utut Adianto, graded 25.98, and this game was played in the Europe versus Asia Rapid match in 2001. Again, we see this characteristic move c3 by black, blocking the c file and enabling c5, and this time Adianto played the restrained e3. This doesn't prevent black from developing his pieces coherently in any way, and Kasparov was happy to play knight c6, and after queen e2 he went bishop f5. Now when you deploy your bishop in this way, it looks very nice, but you've got to be careful that white doesn't somehow arrange to play e4. So that's why after bishop b2, white's position is a bit like a coiled spring. If he can manage to push his central pawns at the right moment, the actively placed black pieces are going to be swept away. So black must take action immediately, and this Kasparov does with e5. A very, very good move. Well, knight c4. Not much future here in taking on e5 with the knight, as after knight takes e5, d takes e5, bishop d3, white is already in trouble. So knight c4, e4, knight fe5, Kasparov took the knight, and then he played h5, both preventing g4 by white, and threatening at some stage maybe h4 by black, tickling the white king side. Queen b5. Could there be pressure looming against the black queen side? No, says Kasparov, I'm simply going to play queen c7. If you want to take on c5 in this position, I'll let you. Then comes rook fc8, and I can't be stopped from regaining my pawn, after which the white pawn structure starts to look very ragged. So Adianto kept things together in grandmasterly fashion with rook fd1, and black played rook fc8. So if we're talking strictly about the opening, I think we can safely say that black has emerged in good shape. He's got active pieces, the bishop on g2 is blocked in, and well, white's bishop on b2 isn't that great either. Question of where black goes from here. Well, Adianto plays c4. Again, logical, thematic, gradually unfolding the centre. Knight e8 was played by Kasparov. White went h3, and now black played knight d6. Queen takes c5 was played. Off came the queens, and now rook takes c5. The two players hurtled into an endgame here after rook takes e5, and white played rook a d1. Rook a5, of course, black has slightly the better of things due to his 2 pawn islands against white's 3 pawn islands, but you can't help but feel with best play this should be a draw. However, who said anything about best play in a rapid game? So the game continues. Bishop e6, bishop takes e4, rook takes c4, rook d8 check. Maybe white should have just settled for rook takes c4 in this position, and after bishop takes b7, bishop takes a2. Despite the passed pawn on a7, it really should be a draw this position, I reckon. But rook d8, okay, king g7, perhaps Adianto was playing for the win here, after bishop takes b7, check, but then rook c1, and then rook takes a2. Rook takes a2, bishop takes a2. And again, it becomes clear that in this position, it should be a draw, but white is the only one who's actually fighting to achieve that draw, thanks to the passed pawn on the a file, the most valuable pawn on the board. After e4, Kasparov set the pawn rolling. White centralised with bishop d5, and black pinned with rook d1. Obviously, he could trade on d5 and play king f6, but then after rook a8, rook a1, d6, king e6, and then rook a6, again, this position tends towards equality. Both players are holding each other at bay. So, after bishop d5, rook d1, rook d7, Kasparov traded, and then brought his king in. Note, taking with the rook here will be a very bad idea for white, as after rook takes d5, black reaches a one king and pawn ending. So white's got to keep the rooks on. Black plays king f6. White goes f4 to stop perhaps king e5. Rook d3, cutting the king off. And now white plays h4. a4. White's got to go after that pawn. Black pushes on. King f2, king f5, rook takes f7 check, and now king e4. So very good play by Kasparov here, getting his king as active as he can. Rook f6 was played. a2, rook e6 check, king takes d5, rook a6. Rook d2 check, protecting the pawn, and now rook g2, king f3 was answered by rook c2. Well, now as black's king is threatening to invade, followed by the queening of the pawn, white needs some counterplay on the queen side. So it's very important to play a move like f5 here, in order to give his king a bit of room. And that's exactly what happened. After rook f2 check king g5, white was on the way finally to creating a passed pawn, which is what he needs if he's going to hold this game. Nevertheless, Kasparov was able to steer the game towards a successful conclusion after king c4. I mean, king g6 now, again, perhaps that was prompted by a lack of time. Probably rook a8 is the best move. And after king b3, king g5, rook takes pawn check, king takes f5, I think this position should be a draw. The white rook will sacrifice itself for the a pawn, and then the black king is a bit too far away. But it just goes to show you, if you mount enough pressure, even against the strongest opponents, they crack. And we'll see now that black can actually win this. After rook takes g3 check, king takes f5, and now rook a3. Well played, Kasparov. There are a few intermediary checks, but of course it's totally different this time, because the black king is much closer. So after king g6, rook g1 check, king h6, standard recipe, checking the white king to the side so the black king can come closer. In comes the king. Rook h1, h6, king f7, and mate next move. So what can we say about this opening variation? Come back to the position after castles. Well, there were two ways white could play it. He could delay castling and play c4 first, after which he gets the chance to take on d5. We've seen there that c5 represents a good practical bet for black. In the line where white delays c4, I think taking on c4, interjecting c3, and then lashing out with c5 is the right way, and should give black very good counterplay. I'm not saying you shouldn't fear the fianchetto variation. On the contrary, it's a logical way to play with white, and dangerous. But I hope I've shown you adequate counters for the second play.